Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of history. A journey that will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval times. That long, thousand-year stretch of our past that we've been taught was dark, dreary, and devoid of any real joy. What if I were to tell you a secret? A secret so big and so contrary to everything you've learned that it might make you question the very nature of history itself. What if I told you that the people who lived 1,000 years ago, our ancestors, in castles and cottages were actually more sexually adventurous, more open about their desires, and more complex in their passions than most people living in America today? What if the so-called Dark Ages were not dark at all, but were actually lit up with the bright, flickering flames of passion, filled with scandals that would make headlines today, and driven by desires so wild, so untamed, that our modern, supposedly liberated society would blush in disbelief? And what if, to top it all off, I told you that the Catholic Church, yes, the very same institution that was preaching the virtues of celibacy and the purity of a life without sex, was in fact secretly, or sometimes not so secretly, running some of the most profitable and well-organized brothels in all of medieval Europe? I know it sounds completely impossible. I know it sounds like a wild conspiracy theory or the plot of a sensational novel. Your history textbooks, the ones you read in school, painted a very different picture, didn't they? They showed us a world of prudish, God-fearing people. Men and women who were so repressed and afraid of their own bodies that they barely held hands before they were safely married. But tonight, I am going to pull back the heavy velvet curtain on the most forbidden secrets of medieval sexuality. These are secrets so scandalous, so shocking, that for centuries, historians have only been whispering about them in the quiet, dusty corridors of universities, afraid to tell the full, unvarnished truth to the public. Before we dive headfirst into this incredible and hidden world together, I would genuinely love it if you could take a moment to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. But please, only do so if you are genuinely excited about the idea of uncovering these forgotten truths with me, of peeling back the layers of history to find the real, messy, human story underneath. And I'm also really curious, where are you all watching from tonight? Are you tucked into your bed in New York, cozy with a cup of tea? Maybe you're listening to this from your comfortable living room in sunny California, taking a break from the hustle and bustle of modern life. Please, drop a comment below and let me know what time it is where you are. There's something truly magical about the idea of all of us, from all over the world, discovering these incredible secrets together at the same time, connected by curiosity and a love for the real stories of the past. It doesn't matter where we are in the world. We are all part of this shared journey. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable in your chair or on your sofa. Maybe turn on a fan for some gentle, soothing background sound. And let's embark on this eye-opening and truly unforgettable adventure together. You see, everything, for me, started to unravel, started to come into focus, when I was doing some research in the dusty, forgotten archives of a medieval studies library just last year. I was expecting to find the usual, boring historical documents, old church records detailing baptisms and burials, and tedious farm inventories listing bushels of wheat and heads of cattle. Instead, I stumbled upon a document, a single piece of parchment that made my jaw literally drop to the floor. It was a 13th century tax record from the City of London, and on it, listed as a legitimate and taxable source of income for the royal crown, were licensed prostitutes. This wasn't hidden income from some illegal activity that was being secretly taxed. This was official, church-sanctioned, taxable income. That single moment, staring at that ancient piece of paper, changed everything for me. I realized in a flash of insight that the medieval world wasn't the sexually repressed and boring society that we have all been told about. It was actually a complex, passionate, and surprisingly open world. A world where human sexuality danced a delicate and often dangerous waltz with sin, with power, and with the simple, raw need for survival. Think about it this way. Imagine if someone from the year 3005, a historian from the distant future, tried to understand American sexuality today by only reading church newsletters and official government documents. They would probably come to the conclusion that we were all celibate monks and nuns, living quiet lives of prayer and purity, right? That is exactly what has happened with our understanding of medieval history. For centuries, we have been getting our information from the very people who had every single reason to hide the truth from us, the church scribes and the royal chroniclers, who were basically the medieval equivalent of modern corporate public relations departments. Their job was to present a clean, polished, and morally upright version of their world. But the real story, the true, messy human story, is written in the margins of those official documents. It's whispered in the dark corners of confessionals, and it's hidden away in the dusty account books of bathhouses and taverns. It is a story of passionate love affairs that literally changed the course of kingdoms, of powerful religious leaders who preached about the importance of purity by day, and then practiced something very, very different by night. And it's a story of ordinary people, men and women just like us, who found ways to love, to desire, and to connect with each other, despite living under some of the most restrictive and controlling moral codes in all of human history. Let me try to paint you a picture of what medieval Europe actually looked like. A picture that is far more vibrant and alive than the one you might have in your head. Picture the city of London in the year 1200. The River Thames is bustling with ships from all across the known world, bringing in goods and people from faraway lands. The air in the city is thick with a mix of smells, the warm, comforting scent of fresh bread baking in the ovens, the exotic aroma of spices from distant and mysterious lands, and yes, the unmistakable electric energy of human desire, just across the river from the respectable, well-ordered city center. There lies a district called Southern, a place so notorious for its brothels, its taverns, and its general lawlessness that it was literally called the Liberty of the Clink. But here is the real kicker, the part that makes this story so incredible. This wasn't some underground criminal enterprise that the authorities were constantly trying to shut down. This was a legal, regulated, and church-owned business district, where the powerful Bishop of Winchester personally collected rent from over 100 licensed prostitutes. The very same church that was preaching to the people every Sunday about the dangers of lust and the eternal damnation that awaited sinners was literally the landlord to the largest and most famous red light district in all of England. The very same religious institution that was telling married couples that they should only have sex for the purpose of having children was making a tidy profit from businesses, where pleasure was the main product being sold. And this wasn't something that was unique to London. The city of Paris had its own officially approved pleasure districts. The city of Venice built a large part of its reputation on its sophisticated and elegant courtesan culture, where educated and talented women provided intellectual companionship, right alongside physical pleasure to the wealthy merchants and visiting dignitaries who flocked to the city. Even Rome, the very heart of Christianity, the home of the Pope himself, had neighborhoods where earthly pleasures were not just tolerated, but were actively taxed and regulated by the papal authorities. But perhaps the thing that surprised me the most in all of my research was discovering just how emotionally complex and rich these medieval relationships really were. These weren't just crude and simple business transactions or sinful indulgences that people felt guilty about later. I found love letters written between knights and their secret lovers that would make modern romance novels seem tame and boring. By comparison, I discovered court records from adultery trials that read like the most dramatic and scandalous soap operas you have ever seen. And I uncovered clear evidence of same-sex relationships that were conducted with a level of openness and acceptance that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years. The truth is, medieval people understood something very important about human nature that we, in our modern world, have somehow forgotten. They knew that desire, in all of its many forms, is one of the most powerful and unstoppable forces in human existence. They knew that trying to completely suppress it, to push it down and pretend it doesn't exist, would only make it stronger, more dangerous, and more likely to corrupt the very institutions that were trying to control it. So, they created this fascinating and contradictory world. A world where sin and sanctity, the sacred and the profane, lived right next to each other, side by side. It was a world where a monk could write the most beautiful and moving religious poetry in the morning and then slip away to meet his secret lover in the evening. It was a world where a queen could be crowned as a symbol of pure Christian virtue and, at the same time, maintain passionate and scandalous affairs that would go on to influence the politics of entire kingdoms. Over the next 14 parts of our journey together, we are going to explore every single shadowy corner of this hidden and forbidden world. We will meet popes who had multiple mistresses and fathered numerous children. We will discover the shocking truth about what really happened during the Crusades, when hundreds of thousands of men were separated from their wives and families for years at a time. We will learn about the medieval methods of birth control, which were both incredibly ingenious and absolutely terrifying. And we will uncover evidence that suggests that medieval people might have actually been more sexually liberated and open-minded than we are today. But our story tonight is just beginning, because what I am about to tell you next will fundamentally change how you think about the relationship between power and passion in medieval Europe. When we return, I am going to reveal the shocking truth about how the Catholic Church's ban on priests getting married had absolutely nothing to do with spiritual purity and everything to do with one of the biggest and most successful financial scandals in all of medieval history. Trust me, you will not want to miss what happens next. The secrets that we are about to uncover will make you question everything you thought you knew about religion, about power, and about human nature itself. So stay with me as we dive deeper and deeper into the forbidden world of medieval sexuality. A world where the line between sin and salvation was far blurrier than anyone in power wants to admit. So here we are, standing at the very edge of one of history's most carefully and successfully guarded secrets. I want you to picture this. The year is 1139, and Pope Innocent II is about to make a decision. A single decision that will fundamentally and permanently alter the course of Christianity forever. With just a simple stroke of a pen, he declares that all priests, from this day forward, must remain celibate. There will be no more wives for them, no more families, and no more of the earthly human love that everyone else was allowed to enjoy. The official reason that was given to the public for this dramatic change was the pursuit of spiritual purity. The real reason? Well, that's where our story starts to get really, really interesting. You see, I used to believe the textbook explanation for this too. I used to think that the rule of celibacy was introduced because the church wanted its priests to be completely and totally devoted to God, free from all the distractions and responsibilities of having a family. It sounds very noble when you put it that way, doesn't it? It sounds almost romantic in its deep spiritual idealism. But then, while I was digging through the dusty archives, I discovered an old financial record from the Vatican that told a completely different and far more cynical story. It was a story that involved complicated inheritance laws, massive and strategic land grabs, and what might just be the most successful and brilliant corporate takeover in all of human history. Let me take you back to a time in medieval Europe. Before the year 1139, a time when priests could get married just like anyone else, and many of them, a great many of them, did. You might have had Father Johannes in a small village in Bavaria who had 3 happy and healthy children. You might have had Father William in the English countryside, who owned huge pieces of land that he was planning to pass down to his sons when he died. All across Europe, the families of priests were slowly but surely accumulating a great deal of wealth, land, and political power, and they were doing so at an alarming rate. Alarming, that is, if you were one of the powerful figures sitting in Rome, watching as your church's most valuable assets were slowly slipping away from your control and into the private hands of family inheritances. Here's exactly what was happening. When a married priest died, all of his property, his land, his house, his money, didn't go back to the church that he had served his entire life. It went to his children, just like it would in any other family. I want you to imagine the leaders of the Vatican sitting in their grand palaces, watching helplessly as some of the most prime farmland in Europe, some of the most profitable local businesses, and even entire monasteries were being passed down from father to son, through the families of priests, generation after generation. The church was literally hemorrhaging its wealth and its land, losing it all to the children of its own clergy. But the decree of celibacy changed everything, literally overnight. Suddenly, priests were no longer allowed to have legal heirs. And when a priest died, all of the property that he had controlled during his lifetime went right back to the church. There were no more wives to support, no more children to inherit, and no more messy family arguments over who owned what. From a purely business perspective, it was an absolutely brilliant and ruthless move. And the true beauty of it was that they could present it to the public as a great spiritual advancement, a step towards a purer and more holy church, rather than what it really was, the largest and most successful property consolidation scheme in all of medieval history. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but surely the priests just followed these new rules, right? They were men of God, after all. Oh, my sweet, innocent friend. This is where the story gets deliciously scandalous and deeply human. The reality is that many, many priests simply ignored the new requirement of celibacy entirely. They kept their wives. They just started calling them their housekeepers or their nieces. They continued to have children. They just couldn't legally acknowledge them as their own. Some priests, and this is a documented fact, even had multiple secret families in different parishes that they served. And the church, for the most part, knew that all of this was happening. But as long as the very important issue of property, inheritance, was solved, they often just turned a blind eye to these very creative interpretations of the rule of celibacy. I have found records from 13th century England that show that over 40% of all the parish priests in the country were living with women and raising children. In some parts of France, that number was even higher. There is a particularly amusing document from the year 1204 where a bishop writes a letter to the Pope, basically saying, "Your Holiness," about this celibacy thing. The priests in my region are interpreting it very, very flexibly. But here is where the story takes a much darker and more tragic turn. Because while many of the priests found clever ways to get around the requirement of celibacy, their unofficial wives and their unacknowledged children were forced to live in a kind of legal limbo, a gray area of society that was both heartbreaking and incredibly dangerous. These women had no legal right to inherit any property from the men they had lived with for years. Their children had no legal rights at all. If a priest died suddenly or was transferred to a different parish, his entire family could be left completely broke and homeless overnight. I discovered the story of a woman named Margaret of Winchester, who lived as the housekeeper of a man named Father Thomas for over 20 years and had 4 children with him. When Father Thomas died in the year 1287, the church immediately seized all of his property, and Margaret and her children were literally thrown out onto the street. She had no legal way to fight back, no rights to claim, and no official recognition of her relationship. She had devoted her entire life to a man and to a church that, in the end, refused to even acknowledge her existence. And this wasn't just a one-time incident. There are hundreds and hundreds of similar stories scattered throughout the medieval records. These are the stories of women who loved priests, who raised their children, who managed their households, but who, in the eyes of the law, simply did not exist. They were the invisible victims of the church's clever financial maneuvering. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this whole story is how it created an entire underground economy, an economy that was built on desire and on deception. Since priests could no longer legally get married, but many of them still wanted the companionship and love of a partner, a very complex and hidden system began to develop, a system where relationships had to exist in the shadows. Some priests kept their relationships completely secret from everyone. Others were more open about their housekeepers, but they always maintained the official story that they were celibate. And some of them decided that if they were going to break one of the church's rules, they might as well break a few of the others while they were at it. This is where we start to see the beginning of what I like to call clerical sexual tourism. Priests who were not allowed to have wives began to visit brothels and bathhouses with a surprising and increasing regularity. The very same church. Records that keep track of all the violations of the celibacy rule also documented a surprising increase in the number of priests who were being caught in compromising and embarrassing situations in the local houses of pleasure. There is a wonderfully scandalous record from the city of Paris in the year 1298, where 3 priests were caught together at a bathhouse that, let's just say, offered a lot more than just washing services. The bishop's response to this incident wasn't one of moral outrage. It was a concern that the priests had been caught by regular people, by lay people, and that it would create a public scandal. The unwritten message was clear. What you do in your private time is your own business. Just don't get caught doing it. This created a very bizarre situation where the church was, at the same time, preaching about the importance of sexual purity, while many of its own representatives were living some of the most sexually adventurous and varied lives in all of medieval Europe. And because these priests were educated, they were wealthy, and they were powerful. They had access to sexual experiences that ordinary people at the time could only ever dream of. But the most ironic twist in this whole story is that the very rule of celibacy, the one that was supposed to get rid of all the sexual scandals in the church, actually ended up creating even more of them. When you force something as powerful as human love and desire to go underground, it doesn't just disappear. It just becomes more creative, more dangerous, and infinitely more interesting to study. I have found evidence of secret love affairs between priests that went on to influence who was elected as the next pope. I have discovered records of powerful bishops who maintained multiple mistresses in different cities across Europe. I have even uncovered documents that suggest that some of the high-ranking officials in the Vatican were essentially running their own high-end escort services for all of the visiting clergy. The more that I dug into these old archives, the more I began to realize that the story of medieval church sexuality wasn't just about a few individual priests who were breaking the rules. It was about an entire system, an entire institution, that had created a massive contradiction right at its very core. The church was demanding something from its clergy that went against the most fundamental parts of human nature. And then it created all of these elaborate and complicated systems to manage all of the inevitable violations of those demands. And here is the part that really gets me. The very same church officials who were making these strict rules about celibacy were not celibate themselves. Pope Innocent IV, who was responsible for enforcing many of the strictest celibacy requirements, had a long-term mistress and at least 2 children of his own. Pope Clement VI owned property jointly with his former wife, even after he had become the pope. The hypocrisy wasn't something that was hidden away. It was systematic, it was widespread, and it was right out in the open for anyone who was paying attention to see. This pattern of do as I say, not as I do, would go on to define the sexuality of the church for many centuries to come. But what happened when the ordinary people, the regular folks in the pews, started to notice this huge contradiction? What happened when the knights and the nobles began to understand that the very same religious authorities who were preaching to them every Sunday about sexual morality were living by a completely different set of rules themselves? That is where our next chapter begins. Because the collision between the authority of the church and the power of human desire is about to create something entirely new in medieval culture. It was a system of courtly love and romantic relationships that would be far more sophisticated, far more passionate, and surprisingly more modern than anything we might expect to find in the so-called Dark Ages. When we continue, I am going to reveal how medieval knights and ladies developed what might just be the most elaborate and complicated dating system in all of human history. A system that was complete with love letters that would make modern romance novels seem tame, secret codes that were hidden in poetry, and grand tournament competitions that were basically the medieval equivalent of modern dating apps. Trust me, after this, you will never look at the idea of medieval romance in the same way again. Imagine for a moment that you are a young knight living in 12th century France. You have just seen your local priest, the man who is supposed to be your spiritual guide, sneaking out of a local brothel, just a few days after he gave a long sermon about the importance of moral purity. You have seen powerful bishops with their mistresses and wealthy abbots with their secret families. The very institution that is supposed to be your moral compass, the one that tells you right from wrong, is spinning wildly out of control. So, what do you do in a situation like that? You decide to create your own rules for love and for desire. And that is exactly what happened. The medieval nobles, the knights, and the ladies of the court invented what might just be the most sophisticated, the most elaborate, and the surprisingly most modern dating culture in all of human history. Welcome to the world of courtly love, a world where romance was turned into a beautiful and complex art form. An art form so intricate and so full of rules that it makes modern dating apps look like child's play in comparison. But here is the big twist in the story, the part that will completely blow your mind. This entire elaborate system was built around one single fundamental rule, a rule that would make any modern relationship counselor faint from the shock of it all. The rule was this: the most perfect love could never be consummated. The more forbidden and the more impossible the love was, the more pure and the more noble it was considered to be. I know what you are probably thinking right now. Wait a minute. So they created an entire culture that was all about not having sex? Well, not exactly. You see, that is where the true genius of the medieval nobles really shines through. They created a system that had its official, public rules and its unofficial, private realities. They had their public performances of chaste love and their private arrangements for something much more physical. It was like having an Instagram account for all of your official relationships and a secret Snapchat account for what was really going on behind the scenes. Let me tell you about a woman named Eleanor of Aquitaine, who is basically the medieval equivalent of a celebrity matchmaker, a relationship guru, and a scandal generator, all rolled into one. This woman was so powerful and so influential that she was married to two different kings. First, she was married to King Louis VII of France, and then she was married to King Henry II of England. But her real legacy, the thing that she is most remembered for today, was creating the cultural framework that turned the pursuit of romance into an elaborate and entertaining game. A game that would go on to influence Western culture for many centuries to come. Eleanor established what historians now call the courts of love. These were actual real-life legal proceedings, where the nobles of her court would gather to debate complicated questions about romance, just like lawyers arguing about constitutional law. Picture this. The year is 1170, and Eleanor is presiding over a session of her court of love. The pressing legal question of the day is whether or not true love can possibly exist between a married couple. The official verdict, after a long and passionate debate, was a resounding, absolutely not. Marriage, in their view, was for making political alliances and for securing economic benefits. True love, pure love, the kind of transcendent and life-changing love that they wrote poems about, could only ever exist outside the boring and practical bounds of marriage. These were not just philosophical discussions that were happening in some dusty old castle library. These were huge public events, attended by hundreds of nobles, with formal rules of evidence, with witness testimony, and with written verdicts that were copied down by scribes and then distributed all across Europe. They were, in effect, creating a whole new legal system just for romance, a system that was complete with its own appeals processes and its own precedent-setting cases. The most famous case that came out of these courts of love involved a knight named Andreas Capellanus, who literally wrote the rulebook for courtly love. His book, The Art of Courtly Love, became the medieval equivalent of a modern dating manual, and it went viral all across Europe. In his book, Andreas laid out 31 specific and detailed rules for proper romantic conduct, and reading them today is an absolutely fascinating experience because they are, at the same time, completely foreign to us and weirdly familiar. Rule number 1. Marriage is no real excuse for not loving. Rule number 14. The easy attainment of love makes it of little value. Difficulty of attainment makes it prized. Rule number 26. Love can deny nothing to love. These were not just simple suggestions for how to behave. These were the actual laws of romance, and they were enforced by the powerful forces of social pressure and the judgments of the court of love. But here is where the story gets really interesting. While the official rules of courtly love all talked about the importance of a spiritual connection and an impossible, unfulfilled longing, the practical reality of the situation was far more flexible. The knights and the ladies of the court developed an incredibly sophisticated and complex system of secret communication, a system that would make modern teenagers green with envy. They had their own coded languages that they would hide in there. Poetry. They had symbolic flower arrangements that could be used to convey very specific and secret messages. And they even had architectural features that were built into their castles, all designed to make it easier for them to have secret meetings with their lovers. I've discovered the records of a castle in the south of France where the lady of the house had a special and secret chamber built. This chamber had hidden passages that allowed her to meet with the visiting knights who were staying at the castle, without ever being seen by her husband or any of his guards. The chamber was officially described in the castle's plans as a prayer room, but the architectural layout strongly suggests that it was designed for activities that were decidedly more earthly than they were heavenly. And then, of course, there were the tournaments. Oh, the tournaments. These were not just simple athletic competitions. These were elaborate and spectacular dating shows, where the knights could show off their skills and their prowess for the ladies that they were trying to win over. But the real action at these tournaments was happening in all of the little details that the regular spectators couldn't see. The knights would wear the colors of their chosen ladies. They would carry a token from her, like a scarf or a glove, into the battle with them. And they would perform very specific and symbolic gestures that were meant to communicate private and secret messages to their beloved who was watching from the stands. There is a wonderful story from a tournament that was held in Champagne in the year 1174, where a knight named Godefroy de Laney performed so brilliantly that he won the entire competition. But then he immediately forfeited his prize and his victory, because his secret lady love had sent him a secret signal, a dropped handkerchief, that was meant to tell him that she wanted him to lose gracefully rather than to appear too aggressive and boastful. The crowd was completely confused by his actions, but Godefroy understood the message perfectly. It was all just a part of an elaborate and silent romantic conversation that was happening in the full view of hundreds of people who had no idea what they were really watching. But perhaps the most ingenious part of this whole entire system was the love letter network. The medieval nobles created what was essentially the very first social media platform just for romance. The knights and the ladies would exchange letters with each other, letters that were written in elaborate and beautiful, poetic codes. These letters would be passed through a network of trusted servants and sympathetic members of the clergy. These secret letters would travel hundreds of miles, crossing over political borders and language barriers, and in doing so, they created a European-wide community of romantic correspondence. I found a collection of letters between a French knight and an Italian noblewoman that went on for a full 15 years and included over 200 individual messages. They never actually met in person for more than just a few days at a time, but through their letters, they were able to create an intimate and deeply emotional relationship, a relationship that was far more complex and rich than many modern marriages. In their letters, they shared their dreams, their fears, and their philosophical ideas. And yes, they also shared increasingly explicit and passionate expressions of their physical desire for each other. All of it written in beautiful and poetic metaphors that could be easily read as just innocent spiritual thoughts if the letters were ever intercepted by the wrong person. The woman in this correspondence, a lady named Beatrice, was married to a very powerful duke. But her letters reveal that her real emotional and intellectual life was happening in this secret relationship with her knight. She wrote about feeling like she was living two completely separate lives. Her public role as a beautiful and dutiful wife and a political ally to her husband, and her private identity as a passionate and intelligent woman who is capable of deep romantic and sexual feelings. And this was not an unusual situation at all. I have found evidence of similar secret correspondence networks all throughout medieval Europe. There were, in effect, underground romantic communities where the nobles would share lovers, exchange partners, and create these extended networks of emotional and physical relationships that existed right alongside their official marriages and their political alliances. But here is what really fascinated me about the world of medieval courtly love. It gave women a level of power and agency in their romantic relationships that would not be seen again in Europe for many, many centuries. In the official rules of courtly love, the lady was always the superior party. The knight was her servant. He had to please her, and he had to obey all of her commands. She had the power to accept or to reject his advances. She was the one who set the terms of their relationship. And she could even command him to go and love someone else if she chose to. This was a revolutionary idea in a world where women were generally considered to be nothing more than property to be traded between men for a political advantage. Within the world of courtly love, women became the ultimate authorities on all matters of the heart. They held their own court sessions where they would judge the romantic behavior of men. They set the standards for courtship, standards that required genuine emotional intelligence and a great deal of creativity. They demanded to be wooed with poetry, with music, and with intelligent conversation, rather than just with political power and military strength. Eleanor of Aquitaine took this so seriously that she established what were essentially finishing schools for knights. These were educational programs where the young nobles would learn not just military skills, but also how to write poetry, how to play music, how to have a good conversation, and all of the fine arts of romantic pursuit. These were not optional courses. If you wanted to succeed in the high society of the nobles, you had to master the art of courtly love just as thoroughly as you had to master the art of swordplay. But of course, this is medieval Europe that we are talking about, so nothing ever stayed pure and spiritual for very long. What started out as an idealized and perfect system of impossible, unrequited love gradually evolved into something that was much more practical and, frankly, a lot more fun. The knights and the ladies began to find very creative ways to honor the spirit of courtly love while also finding loopholes in the rules that would allow them to satisfy their more earthly and physical desires. The whole concept of courtly love became a kind of social cover, a respectable excuse for relationships that were definitely not remaining on a purely spiritual plane. As long as you followed all of the proper forms, as long as you wrote the appropriate poetry, as long as you performed all of the required gestures, and as long as you maintained the official story of an impossible and unfulfilled longing, you could actually conduct some very satisfying love affairs with the full approval of society. This contradiction between the ideal and the reality would go on to define the world of medieval romance for many centuries to come. But what happened? When these elaborate and romantic games collided with the brutal and practical realities of medieval marriage? What happened when these passionate love affairs had to coexist with the cold, hard facts of political alliances, of property arrangements, and of the very practical business of producing legitimate heirs to carry on the family name? That is where our story takes its most dramatic and interesting turn. Because when we pull back the curtain on the medieval marriage beds, we are going to discover some practices that are so shocking, so unexpected, that they will make everything that we have talked about so far seem quaint and tame by comparison. The intersection of love, of politics, and of sexuality in medieval marriage was not just complicated. It was absolutely wild, in ways that will completely change how you think about both medieval and modern relationships forever. You see, just across the River Thames from the most respectable churches and the grand royal palaces of medieval London, there was a district that was so notorious, so infamous, that it was literally called the Liberty of the Clink. But the local people who lived there knew it by a much more colorful and descriptive name, the Devil's Acre. And here's the part of the story that will absolutely blow your mind. This wasn't some hidden, underground criminal enterprise that the authorities were constantly trying to shut down. This was a completely legal, highly regulated, and church-owned business district, where the powerful Bishop of Winchester himself collected the rent from over 100 licensed prostitutes. He also operated bathhouses that offered a whole lot more than just washing services, and he maintained what might have been the most sophisticated and well-run adult entertainment complex in all of medieval Europe. I know what you are thinking. Surely this can't possibly be true. The very same church that was preaching to the people every Sunday about the importance of sexual purity and was threatening them with eternal damnation for having lustful thoughts was literally running its own red light district. But I have the tax records to prove it. I have the official licensing documents. I even have the complaint letters that were written by the nearby residents, who were apparently less bothered by the moral implications of what was going on and more bothered by the high noise levels on the weekend nights. The Bishop of Winchester didn't just tolerate the practice of prostitution in Southwark. He actively managed it, just like a modern business corporation. Every single woman who worked in the district had to get an official license from him. She had to pay regular fees to the church. She had to agree to regular health inspections. And she had to follow a very detailed set of regulations about everything, from the kind of clothes she was allowed to wear to her specific working hours. The church, in effect, created what was essentially the very first regulated sex industry in all of European history. A system that was complete with its own worker protections, its own quality standards, and even its own retirement benefits for the women who worked there. Let me tell you about the Winchester geese, as these licensed women were called. They were not desperate women who were working on the streets, and they were not the victims of trafficking. Many of them were educated and entrepreneurial women who chose to do this kind of work because it offered them a level of independence and financial security that was simply not available to them in any other career that was open to medieval women. Some of the most successful of the Winchester geese owned their own property. They invested their money in other businesses. and they lived much more comfortably than many of the so-called respectable married women of their time. There is a fascinating record of a woman named Alice de Salisbury, who worked as a Winchester goose for over 15 years. In that time, she was able to accumulate enough wealth to purchase 3 different houses in the city of London, and she eventually became a moneylender to some of the minor nobles. When she died in the year 1298, the value of her estate was more than what some of the knights at the time earned in an entire year. Alice had cleverly turned the contradictions of medieval society's views on sexuality into her own personal fortune. But Southwark was not a unique place. Every single major city in medieval Europe had its own officially approved pleasure districts. The city of Paris had the Rue Glatini, where prostitution was not only legal, but was also taxed by the king. The city of Venice built a large part of its international reputation on its sophisticated and elegant courtesan culture, where educated and talented women would provide intellectual companionship right alongside physical pleasure to the wealthy, merchants, and the visiting dignitaries who came to the city. Even the city of Rome, the very heart of Christianity and the home of the Pope, had neighborhoods where these earthly pleasures were regulated and taxed by the papal authorities themselves. The bathhouses were particularly clever examples of medieval double talk. Officially, they were just public hygiene facilities, places where people could go to wash themselves and to maintain their health. Unofficially, they were social clubs where men and women could meet. They could mingle, and they could arrange for more private and intimate encounters. Many of the bathhouses offered private chambers. They offered massage services, and they offered entertainment that went far, far beyond what we might expect to find in a medieval spa. I discovered the business records of a bathhouse in the city of Nuremberg that employed over 40 people. They had attendants, they had musicians, they had food servers, and they had women who provided what the records so politely call comfort services. The bathhouse had different sections for the different social classes. It had private suites for its wealthy clients. And it even had special arrangements for the visiting clergy who needed to maintain a certain level of discretion about their presence there. And speaking of the clergy, this is where the hypocrisy of the whole situation becomes almost comical. The very same priests who were preaching about the importance of sexual purity on Sunday were often the very best customers at these establishments during the rest of the week. The bathhouse records from all across Europe show that there were regular payments coming in from the local churches, from the monasteries, and from the cathedral chapters. Some of the bathhouses even offered special discounted rates for members of the clergy. And they maintained private entrances for their religious customers who preferred not to be seen by the members of their own congregations. There is a wonderful story from a 14th century chronicle about a bishop who is caught in a very compromising position at a Parisian bathhouse. He tried to claim that he was only there to provide pastoral care for the women who were working there. The writer of the chronicle dryly observed that the bishop seemed to be providing a very hands-on kind of spiritual guidance. The medieval people had a sense of humor about all of these contradictions that we often miss when we read their history in our modern times. But perhaps the most sophisticated part of these medieval pleasure districts was how they also served as unofficial social safety nets for women. In a world where women had very few legal rights and very limited economic opportunities, these districts provided spaces where women could earn their own independent incomes, where they could form supportive communities with other women, and where they could even have a considerable amount of social power. The most successful courtesans and prostitutes often became very influential figures in the social and political networks of their cities. They had access to powerful men, they had access to valuable information, and they had access to financial resources that allowed them to operate as informal brokers and power players in their communities. Some of them used their money to fund charitable works, to support artists and writers, and even to influence political decisions through their wealthy and powerful clients. I found the records of a Venetian courtesan named Veronica Franco, who not only provided companionship services to her clients, but also ran her own literary salon, published her own poetry, and corresponded with some of the most important intellectuals of her time. Veronica used her position in the pleasure economy of Venice to become a respected cultural figure who fought for women's education and for their rights. She had managed to turn the world of medieval sexual commerce into a powerful platform for female empowerment. The systems that were put in place to regulate these districts were surprisingly sophisticated. And in many ways, they were more protective of women's rights than the legal systems that governed marriage. The licensed prostitutes had the right to refuse any client they wanted. They had the right to set their own prices, and they had the right to appeal to the authorities if they were ever mistreated. They had access to medical care, they had access to legal representation, and they even had access to retirement planning, all of which were benefits that were simply not available to most of the married women of their time. But the most fascinating part of these medieval pleasure districts was how they served as spaces for sexual experimentation and education that were not available anywhere else in medieval society. While the married couples were expected to limit all of their sexual activities to just procreation, and while the courtly lovers were supposed to maintain a state of spiritual purity, the bathhouses and the brothels became the laboratories for erotic exploration. The medieval pleasure districts were the places where people could explore same-sex relationships, where they could experiment with different sexual practices, and where they could engage in forms of intimacy that were forbidden, or simply impossible within the strict confines of marriage and courtly love. They were the only spaces in all of medieval society where sexuality could be openly discussed, where it could be learned about, and where it could be practiced without all of the heavy weight of moral judgment or the fear of political consequences. I discovered a medical text that was written by a physician who regularly treated clients from the pleasure districts of London. And his observations provide some incredible insights into the sexual practices of the medieval people. He writes about the different contraceptive techniques that they used, about the different sexual positions that they favored, about the aphrodisiac preparations that they used, and even about the treatments for what we would now recognize as sexually transmitted infections. This physician was essentially providing the very first comprehensive sex education in all of European history. And he was doing it all in the context of commercial sexuality. The economics of these districts were also remarkably sophisticated. The most successful establishments were run like modern entertainment complexes. They offered dining, they offered drinking, they offered bathing, they offered entertainment, and they offered accommodation services all right alongside their more intimate offerings. They employed musicians, they employed cooks, they employed security personnel, and they employed managers. They invested their money in luxury furnishings, in artistic decorations, and in architectural features that were all designed to create a certain ambience and comfort for their clients. Some of the most successful madams of these establishments became very wealthy businesswomen. They owned multiple properties, they employed dozens of people, and they operated very complex financial networks. They were essentially running the very first multinational adult entertainment corporations with establishments in multiple cities and with very sophisticated systems for managing their staff, their customers, and all of their revenue. But here is what really gets me about the medieval pleasure districts. They reveal just how pragmatic and realistic the medieval people really were about human sexuality. While the official culture of the time was promoting these impossible ideals of sexual purity and spiritual transcendence, the practical culture was creating these elaborate and complex systems for managing the reality of human desire. They understood that people need a sexual outlet, that they need emotional connection, and that they need physical pleasure. And so they built institutions to provide for all of those needs, safely and profitably. The contradiction of it all was not lost on the medieval people themselves. There are countless contemporary writings from the time that comment on the great irony of the church-owned brothels, of the priest customers, and of the moral authorities who were preaching one thing while they were practicing another. But rather than seeing all of this as just corruption or hypocrisy, many of the medieval writers seem to have viewed it as a necessary accommodation to the realities of human nature. However, this delicate and carefully constructed balance between the official morality and the practical sexuality of the time was about to be completely shattered by one of the most powerful and infamous figures in all of medieval history. A man whose personal appetites were so notorious, so out of control, that they managed to scandalize even this relatively tolerant and pragmatic era. When we continue, I am going to tell you all about the Pope, whose many mistresses and illegitimate children became so numerous that he essentially turned the Vatican itself into his own personal harem, creating a series of scandals that would go on to rock the very foundations of Christianity and to change the course of European history forever. Just across the River Thames, from the most respectable churches and the grand royal palaces of medieval London, there was a district that was so notorious, so infamous, that it was literally called the Liberty of the Clink. But the local people who lived there knew it by a much more colorful and descriptive name, the Devil's Acre. And here is the part of the story that will absolutely blow your mind. This wasn't some hidden underground criminal enterprise that the authorities were constantly trying to shut down. This was a completely legal, highly regulated, and church-owned business district, where the powerful Bishop of Winchester himself collected the rent from over 100 licensed prostitutes. He also operated bathhouses that offered a whole lot more than just washing services, and he maintained what might have been the most sophisticated and well-run adult entertainment complex in all of medieval Europe. I know what you are thinking. Surely this can't possibly be true. The very same church that was preaching to the people every Sunday about the importance of sexual purity and was threatening them with eternal damnation for having lustful thoughts was literally running its own red light district. But I have the tax records to prove it. I have the official licensing documents. I even have the complaint letters that were written by the nearby residents, who were apparently less bothered by the moral implications of what was going on and more bothered by the high noise levels on the weekend nights. The Bishop of Winchester didn't just tolerate the practice of prostitution in Southwark. He actively managed it, just like a modern business corporation. Every single woman who worked in the district had to get an official license from him. She had to pay regular fees to the church. She had to agree to regular health inspections. And she had to follow a very detailed set of regulations about everything from the kind of clothes she was allowed to wear to her specific working hours. The church, in effect, created what was essentially the very first regulated sex industry in all of European history. A system that was complete with its own worker protections, its own quality standards, and even its own retirement benefits for the women who worked there. Let me tell you about the Winchester geese, as these licensed women were called. They were not desperate women who were working on the streets, and they were not the victims of trafficking. Many of them were educated and entrepreneurial women who chose to do this kind of work because it offered them a level of independence and financial security that was simply not available to them in any other career that was open to medieval women. Some of the most successful of the Winchester geese owned their own property. They invested their money in other businesses, and they lived much more comfortably than many of the so-called respectable married women of their time. There is a fascinating record of a woman named Alice de Salisbury, who worked as a Winchester goose for over 15 years. In that time, she was able to accumulate enough wealth to purchase 3 different houses in the city of London, and she eventually became a moneylender to some of the minor nobles. When she died in the year 1298, the value of her estate was more than what some of the knights at the time earned in an entire year. Alice had cleverly turned the contradictions of medieval society's views on sexuality into her own personal fortune. But Southwark was not a unique place. Every single major city in medieval Europe had its own officially approved pleasure districts. The city of Paris had the Rue Glatini, where prostitution was not only legal, but was also taxed by the king. The city of Venice built a large part of its international reputation on its sophisticated and elegant courtesan culture, where educated and talented women would provide intellectual companionship right alongside physical pleasure to the wealthy merchants and the visiting dignitaries who came to the city. Even the city of Rome, the very heart of Christianity and the home of the Pope, had neighborhoods where these earthly pleasures were regulated and taxed by the papal authorities themselves. The bathhouses were particularly clever examples of medieval double talk. Officially, they were just public hygiene facilities, places where people could go to wash themselves and to maintain their health. Unofficially, they were social clubs where men and women could meet, they could mingle, and they could arrange for more private and intimate encounters. Many of the bathhouses offered private chambers, they offered massage services, and they offered entertainment that went far, far beyond what we might expect to find in a medieval spa. I discovered the business records of a bathhouse in the city of Nuremberg that employed over 40 people. They had attendants, they had musicians, they had food servers, and they had women who provided what the records so politely call comfort services. The bathhouse had different sections for the different social classes. It had private suites for its wealthy clients. And it even had special arrangements for the visiting clergy who needed to maintain a certain level of discretion about their presence there. And speaking of the clergy, this is where the hypocrisy of the whole situation becomes almost comical. The very same priests who were preaching about the importance of sexual purity on Sunday were often the very best customers at these establishments during the rest of the week. The bathhouse records from all across Europe show that there were regular payments coming in from the local churches, from the monasteries, and from the cathedral chapters. Some of the bathhouses even offered special discounted rates for members of the clergy, and they maintained private entrances for their religious customers who preferred not to be seen by the members of their own congregations. There is a wonderful story from a 14th century chronicle about a bishop who was caught in a very compromising position at a Parisian bathhouse. He tried to claim that he was only there to provide pastoral care for the women who were working there. The writer of the chronicle dryly observed that the bishop seemed to be providing a very hands-on kind of spiritual guidance. The medieval people had a sense of humor about all of these contradictions that we often miss when we read their history in our modern times. But perhaps the most sophisticated part of these medieval pleasure districts was how they also served as unofficial social safety nets for women. In a world where women had very few legal rights and very limited economic opportunities, these districts provided spaces where women could earn their own independent incomes, where they could form supportive communities with other women, and where they could even have a considerable amount of social power. The most successful courtesans and prostitutes often became very influential figures in the social and political networks of their cities. They had access to powerful men, they had access to valuable information, and they had access to financial resources that allowed them to operate as informal brokers and power players in their communities. Some of them used their money to fund charitable works, to support artists and writers, and even to influence political decisions through their wealthy and powerful clients. I found the records of a Venetian courtesan named Veronica Franco, who not only provided companionship services to her clients, but also ran her own literary salon, published her own poetry, and corresponded with some of the most important intellectuals of her time. Veronica used her position in the pleasure economy of Venice to become a respected cultural figure who fought for women's education and for their rights. She had managed to turn the world of medieval sexual commerce into a powerful platform for female empowerment. The systems that were put in place to regulate these districts were surprisingly sophisticated. And in many ways, they were more protective of women's rights than the legal systems that governed marriage. The licensed prostitutes had the right to refuse any client they wanted. They had the right to set their own prices, and they had the right to appeal to the authorities if they were ever mistreated. They had access to medical care. They had access to legal representation, and they even had access to retirement planning, all of which were benefits that were simply not available to most of the married women of their time. But the most fascinating part of these medieval pleasure districts was how they served as spaces for sexual experimentation and education that were not available anywhere else in medieval society. While the married couples were expected to limit all of their sexual activities to just procreation, and while the courtly lovers were supposed to maintain a state of spiritual purity, the bathhouses and the brothels became the laboratories for erotic exploration. The medieval pleasure districts were the places where people could explore same-sex relationships, where they could experiment with different sexual practices, and where they could engage in forms of intimacy that were forbidden or simply impossible within the strict confines of marriage and courtly love. They were the only spaces in all of medieval society where sexuality could be openly discussed, where it could be learned about, and where it could be practiced without all of the heavy weight of moral judgment or the fear of political consequences. I discovered a medical text that was written by a physician who regularly treated clients from the pleasure districts of London, and his observations provide some incredible insights into the sexual practices of the medieval people. He writes about the different contraceptive techniques that they used, about the different sexual positions that they favored, about the aphrodisiac preparations that they used, and even about the treatments for what we would now recognize as sexually transmitted infections. This physician was essentially providing the very first comprehensive sex education in all of European history, and he was doing it all in the context of commercial sexuality. The economics of these districts were also remarkably sophisticated. The most successful establishments were run like modern entertainment complexes. They offered dining, they offered drinking, they offered bathing, they offered entertainment, and they offered accommodation services, all right alongside their more intimate offerings. They employed musicians, they employed cooks, they employed security personnel, and they employed managers. They invested their money in luxury furnishings, in artistic decorations, and in architectural features that were all designed to create a certain ambience and comfort for their clients. Some of the most successful madams of these establishments became very wealthy businesswomen. They owned multiple properties, they employed dozens of people, and they operated very complex financial networks. They were essentially running the very first multinational adult entertainment corporations with establishments in multiple cities and with very sophisticated systems for managing their staff, their customers, and all of their revenue. But here is what really gets me about the medieval pleasure districts. They revealed just how pragmatic and realistic the medieval people really were about human sexuality. While the official culture of the time was promoting these impossible ideals of sexual purity and spiritual transcendence, the practical culture was creating these elaborate and complex systems for managing the reality of human desire. They understood that people need a sexual outlet, that they need emotional connection, and that they need physical pleasure. And so they built institutions to provide for all of those needs safely and profitably. The contradiction of it all was not lost on the medieval people themselves. There are countless contemporary writings from the time that comment on the great irony of the church-owned brothels, of the priest customers, and of the moral authorities who were preaching one thing while they were practicing another. But rather than seeing all of this as just corruption or hypocrisy, many of the medieval writers seem to have viewed it as a necessary accommodation to the realities of human nature. However, this delicate and carefully constructed balance between the official morality and the practical sexuality of the time was about to be completely shattered by one of the most powerful and infamous figures in all of medieval history. A man whose personal appetites were so notorious, so out of control, that they managed to scandalize even this relatively tolerant and pragmatic era. When we continue, I am going to tell you all about the Pope, whose many mistresses and illegitimate children became so numerous that he essentially turned the Vatican itself into his own personal harem, creating a series of scandals that would go on to rock the very foundations of Christianity and to change the course of European history forever. Behind the golden doors of the Vatican in the year 1492, something was happening that would make even the most scandalous modern reality TV show seem tame and boring by comparison. Pope Alexander VI, who was born with the name Rodrigo Borgia, had just risen to the throne of St. Peter, and with him, he brought a level of sexual excess and corruption that would turn the Holy See into what one observer at the time called a den of thieves and a brothel of whores. But here's the part of the story that will absolutely stagger you. Alexander VI didn't even try to hide his appetites and his desires. He flaunted them, he celebrated them, and he turned the corruption of the papacy into a public spectacle that managed to shock even the relatively tolerant standards of medieval Europe. Let me paint you a picture of what the Vatican actually looked like under the rule of Alexander VI. This wasn't just a simple case of a religious leader who was quietly breaking his vows of celibacy. This was a man who essentially turned the papal palace itself into his own personal pleasure complex. Alexander had at least 4 acknowledged mistresses at the same time. He fathered a minimum of 7 illegitimate children. And he hosted parties that were so wild and so excessive that they would make the ancient Roman orgies look like simple church picnics in comparison. His most famous mistress was a woman named Julia Farnese, who was known throughout the city of Rome as Julia la Bella, which means Julia the Beautiful. She was 25 years younger than the Pope. She was married to another man. And she was so stunningly beautiful that the accounts from the time described men who would literally stop in the street just to stare at her. Alexander was so completely infatuated with Julia that he showered her with expensive gifts. He gave her family members high-ranking positions in the church. And he openly paraded her through the streets of Rome as if she were his wife rather than his mistress. But Julia was not his only companion. There was also Vanessa dei Catani, who was the mother of 4 of his children and who lived in a grand palace that Alexander had purchased for her just a few blocks away from the Vatican. There was an unnamed courtesan who lived in the papal apartments and gave birth to at least 2 of his children right there in the Vatican. And there were countless other women visiting noblewomen, Roman courtesans, and even, according to some of the accounts from the time, the wives of the cardinals and the bishops who would come to the Vatican seeking favors from the Pope. The children that were born from all of these relationships were not hidden away in shame. They were fully integrated into the life of the papal court, like a medieval version of a modern blended family. Alexander's son, Cesare Borgia, was made a cardinal at the young age of 18 and later became a powerful duke. His daughter, Lucretia Borgia, was married off multiple times in order to create political alliances for her father, with the Pope himself personally negotiating her marriage contracts and her dowries. Another one of his sons, Juan, was made the Duke of Gandia and was given huge estates in Spain. Alexander treated his illegitimate children as if they were the legitimate heirs to a royal dynasty, rather than the offspring of a supposedly celibate Pope. He would throw elaborate and expensive parties to celebrate all of their achievements. He would arrange advantageous marriages for them, and he would use the resources of the papacy to fund their political ambitions. The Vatican, under his rule, became less like a religious institution and more like a Renaissance royal court, where all of the Pope's family members were constantly competing with each other for power, for influence, and for wealth. But the most shocking part of Alexander's reign wasn't just his personal behavior. It was how he used sexuality as a powerful tool of papal politics. Alexander would use his mistresses as his own personal diplomatic envoys. He would use his illegitimate children as political pawns in the great game of European politics. And he would use his infamous PayPal parties as opportunities to gather compromising and embarrassing information about all of the visiting dignitaries. He had essentially turned the Vatican itself into a giant honey trap operation where sexual favors were regularly traded for political advantage. The PayPal parties were legendary for their sheer excess. The contemporary accounts from the time describe huge gatherings where the cardinals would dance with the courtesans, where the PayPal mistresses would entertain the foreign ambassadors, and where the line between a religious ceremony and an erotic entertainment completely and totally disappeared. One particularly notorious party that was held in the year 1501 featured what the chroniclers of the time called the Ballet of the Chestnuts. At this party, naked courtesans would crawl around on the floor of the PayPal dining hall, collecting chestnuts, while all of the guests would place bets on their performance. Alexander's approach to sexuality was so brazen, so out in the open, that it managed to scandalize even the most hardened and worldly observers of the Renaissance. The Venetian ambassador at the time wrote a letter to his government in which he said that the PayPal court had become more like a brothel than a holy place. But he also noted in that same letter that Alexander's sexual excess was generating an enormous amount of political leverage for him. The foreign dignitaries who would participate in these wild PayPal parties would often find themselves compromised and much more willing to be compliant with the Pope's wishes. The church officials who wanted to advance their own careers quickly learned that providing Alexander with access to beautiful women was a surefire way to get ahead. The Pope had successfully turned human sexuality into a powerful currency of power. But perhaps the most fascinating part of Alexander's entire reign was how he used medieval theology itself to justify all of his behavior. Alexander argued that, as the representative of God on earth, he was above all of the ordinary moral rules and constraints. He claimed that his sexual relationships were a form of divine blessing, a blessing that he was sharing with a few chosen women. He even went so far as to suggest that his illegitimate children were actually gifts from God, gifts that were intended to strengthen the church through the powerful Borgia bloodline. This was not just a cynical and calculated rationalization for his behavior. Alexander genuinely seemed to believe that his position as the Pope gave him a special dispensation to live his life according to a completely different set of rules than ordinary mortals. He would celebrate the Mass in the morning. He would conduct all of the important PayPal business in the afternoon. And then he would host these elaborate and sexual entertainments in the evening. And he apparently saw no contradiction at all between any of these activities. The impact that Alexander's reign had on the broader church was catastrophic. The priests all across Europe began to openly keep their own mistresses, and they would cite the Pope's own example as their justification. The monasteries became notorious for their own sexual excess. The cathedral chapters were rocked by scandals that involved clerical marriages, homosexual relationships, and financial corruption that was all tied to the trading of sexual favors. But it wasn't just the clergy who were influenced by Alexander's example. The PayPal court itself became a magnet for ambitious women who saw that there were great opportunities for their own advancement through their relationships with the powerful church officials. The city of Rome began to fill up with courtesans, with mistresses, and with aspiring papal concubines, who were all competing with each other for the attention of the cardinals, the bishops, and ultimately, the Pope himself. I found the records of a Venetian noblewoman named Imperia, who had moved to Rome specifically to try and pursue a relationship with a cardinal who was very close to Alexander VI. Imperia was educated. She was beautiful, and she was very strategically minded. She understood that in Alexander's Vatican, sexual relationships were the direct pathways to political power, and within just 3 years, she had become one of the most influential and powerful women in all of Rome. She owned multiple properties. She was funding artistic commissions, and she was even influencing some of the Pope's decisions through her own network of clerical lovers. The financial implications of Alexander's sexual excess were absolutely staggering. The PayPal funds were being diverted to support all of his mistresses, all of his children, and all of the elaborate and expensive entertainments that were used to facilitate his sexual networking. The Vatican's treasury was being drained to fund the dowries for all of his daughters, the military campaigns for all of his sons, and the luxurious lifestyles for all of his various lovers. Alexander's sexual behavior also had some profound diplomatic consequences. The foreign rulers of Europe began to send beautiful women to the papal court as their own unofficial ambassadors. They had come to understand that having access to the Pope's bed was often a much more valuable asset than having the traditional diplomatic credentials. The marriage alliances that involved Alexander's own children became major factors in the politics of Europe, with kings and princes all competing with each other to try and ally themselves with the Pope's illegitimate and powerful family. But perhaps the most shocking revelation of all about Alexander VI is how his sexual excess was all dutifully documented and preserved by the Church itself, rather than trying to hide or to destroy all of the evidence of the papal misconduct. The Vatican scribes were just dutifully recording all of Alexander's relationships, all of his children's activities, and even the very specific details of all of his erotic entertainments. These records strongly suggest that the hierarchy of the Church had completely and totally abandoned any pretense of sexual morality, and had just accepted Alexander's behavior as the new normal. The reign of Alexander VI represents the absolute peak of all the medieval sexual hypocrisy. It was a moment in time when the contradiction between what Christianity was teaching and what Christians were actually practicing became so extreme that it ceased to be hypocrisy at all and just became a completely different and new moral system. Alexander had created a world where sexual excess was seen as a sign of divine favor, where illegitimate children were seen as marks of a papal blessing, and where the Vatican itself had become a grand and glorious pleasure palace. But every extreme action always creates its own reaction, and Alexander's sexual excess was about to trigger a massive backlash, a backlash that would go on to fundamentally change the course of Christianity forever. The stories that we have explored so far, the church-owned brothels, the secret families of the priests, the many mistresses of the popes, these all just represent the very beginning of the complexity of medieval sexuality. When we continue on our journey, we are going to discover how the ordinary medieval people responded to all of this religious hypocrisy by developing their own unique systems for managing sexuality, reproduction, and desire. We are going to explore the hidden and underground world of medieval birth control, a world of secret herbs, of dangerous potions, and of desperate measures that reveals just how determined the medieval people were to take control of their own bodies, even when both the church and the state were conspiring together to deny them that basic human right. Deep in the dark and quiet forest just outside of a medieval village, a desperate woman named Agnes is crouching beside a stream. She is carefully crushing the leaves of a plant that could either save her life or end it. She has already given birth to 6 children, and 3 of them have died before they even reached their first birthday. Her husband is expecting her to produce another heir for him, but Agnes knows in her heart that another pregnancy might just be the thing that kills her. So, she is preparing a special potion from a plant called silphium, a plant that was so valuable for its contraceptive properties that it was literally worth more than its weight in gold. And it was eventually hunted to complete extinction by women just like her. Women who were desperately seeking to have some control over their own bodies. Agnes's story is not a unique one. All across medieval Europe, women were conducting their own secret revolution. They were developing these hidden, underground networks of knowledge. Knowledge about special herbs, about powerful potions, and about secret procedures that could either prevent a pregnancy, they could induce a miscarriage, or they could even enhance a woman's fertility, all depending on what their specific needs were at the time. while the church was busy preaching that sexuality was only for procreation, and while men were controlling almost every single aspect of women's lives. The medieval women were creating their own secret and hidden system for managing their own reproduction, a system that was surprisingly sophisticated, incredibly dangerous, and absolutely essential for their very survival. The most precious and valuable substance in this whole underground economy was a plant called silphium. It was a plant that only grew in a very small region of North Africa, near what is now modern-day Libya. The medieval women had discovered that silphium could effectively prevent a pregnancy when it was taken regularly. And the demand for this plant became so enormous, so widespread, that it eventually drove the plant to complete extinction by the 6th century. At the peak of its popularity, silphium was so valuable that it was actually used as a form of currency. It was stored in the royal treasuries of kings, and it was literally worth its own weight in gold. But silphium was just the beginning of the story. The medieval women had developed an entire pharmacology, a whole science of reproductive control, and they were using plants that grew right there in the forests and the gardens of Europe. Plants like pennyroyal, tansy, rue, and Queen Anne's lace were all combined in very specific and careful proportions in order to create contraceptive teas. The berries of the juniper plant were crushed and then mixed with wine in order to prevent the implantation of a fertilized egg. The seeds of the wild carrot were chewed on a daily basis by women who wanted to avoid getting pregnant without their husbands knowing about it. I discovered a fascinating medical manuscript that was written by a woman in 12th century Germany. This manuscript contains over 50 different recipes for all kinds of contraceptive preparations. The manuscript includes very detailed instructions for how to time the doses of these preparations with the woman's own menstrual cycle. It includes warnings about which combinations of herbs could be lethal if they were taken in the wrong doses. And it even includes advice for how to disguise these contraceptive herbs as just ordinary cooking ingredients, in order to avoid any suspicion from their husbands or from the religious authorities. But here is what really amazed me about the world of medieval birth control. It wasn't just about preventing pregnancies. The medieval women had also developed a very sophisticated, disparate, and complex understanding of how to enhance a woman's fertility when they actually wanted to have children. They had developed methods for trying to determine the sex of their babies, and they had even developed ways to manage the timing of their pregnancies for either political or economic advantage. There were special herbal preparations that were designed to increase the chances of a woman conceiving a male child, which was very crucial in a world where the inheritance laws almost always favored the sons. There were fertility-enhancing potions that were made from very specific combinations of herbs, and they were taken at certain phases of the moon. Some of the women even practiced what we would now recognize as a primitive form of family planning. They would time all of their sexual activity according to their own careful observation of their menstrual cycles and their other fertility signs. This whole system of knowledge was passed down through these hidden networks of women, networks that operated completely outside of all the official medical and religious institutions of the time. The older women would teach the younger women. The midwives would share all of their information with their clients. Even the nuns who were living in the convents were developing and preserving this contraceptive knowledge, despite their own supposed celibacy. All of this information was shared through a kind of coded language. It was hidden away in recipe collections, and it was disguised as just general herbal medicine. But the medieval methods of birth control were not just limited to the herbal remedies. Women had also developed a number of mechanical methods that were both very ingenious and absolutely terrifying. They would use pessaries that were made from all kinds of different materials, and they would insert them into their bodies in order to block a conception from happening. They would practice douching with acidic solutions that were meant to kill the sperm. Some of them even used primitive forms of barrier contraception that were made from animal membranes or from different plant materials. I found the records of a Venetian woman named Caterina, who worked as a kind of unofficial gynecologist. She would provide all of these contraceptive services to the wealthy women all across the north of Italy. Caterina's practice included all of the herbal preparations, all of the mechanical devices, and even some of the surgical procedures that could either prevent a pregnancy or terminate an early one. Her client list included nobles, the wives of merchants, and even the wives of some of the powerful church officials who all needed to be able to manage their reproductive lives with a certain level of discretion. Caterina's records also revealed the enormous and life-threatening risks that the medieval women were facing when they were just trying to control their own reproduction. Many of the herbal preparations that they were using were actually toxic. If they were taken in large doses, the mechanical methods that they were using could cause very serious infections. And all of the surgical procedures were being performed without any kind of anesthesia or any kind of antiseptics. These women were literally risking their own lives, just for the chance to have some small amount of control over when and how often they became pregnant. The most heartbreaking part of the story of medieval birth control was how it revealed the sheer desperation of the women who were trapped in these impossible situations. I have found court records of women who were being prosecuted for the crime of infanticide, and they would defend themselves in court by explaining that they had tried every single contraceptive method that they knew of, but that nothing had worked for them. These were not callous and cruel criminals. These were women who had simply exhausted all of their other options for trying to control their own reproductive lives. The official position of the Church on the matter of contraception was one of absolute and total prohibition. Any attempt by a woman to try and prevent a pregnancy was considered to be a grave sin against the will of God. But even within the religious institutions of the time, there is evidence that this contraceptive knowledge was being preserved and sometimes even quietly shared. I discovered a monastic medical text that includes a number of contraceptive recipes that are all written in a secret code, which suggests that even the religious communities of the time understood the practical necessity of having some form of reproductive control. Perhaps the most fascinating part of the story of medieval birth control was how it all intersected with the broader economy of sexuality that we have been exploring. The women who were working in the medieval pleasure districts were often the ones who were the most knowledgeable about all of the different contraceptive methods, since an unwanted pregnancy could end their careers and could even endanger their very lives. They were the ones who were developing the most sophisticated techniques, and they were the ones who were sharing them with their clients, who were often the married women who were seeking to manage their own reproduction. The bathhouses and the brothels became these informal centers for reproductive health care, places where women could go to get access to contraceptive knowledge, to pregnancy testing, and even to some of the early abortion procedures. The very same establishments that were providing the sexual services were also functioning as a kind of primitive women's health clinic, and they were filling a very important medical need that was being completely ignored by all of the official medical institutions of the time. But contraception wasn't the only aspect of reproductive control that the medieval women were managing through their own underground networks. They had also developed these elaborate and complex systems for managing their pregnancies for childbirth and for the care of their infants, all of which were systems that operated entirely outside of any kind of official medical supervision. The medieval women had created their own obstetric practices, their own pain management techniques, and their own methods of postpartum care, all of which were often much more effective than anything that was being offered by the male physicians of the time. The midwife networks were particularly sophisticated. They were the ones who were preserving all of the knowledge about the safe birthing positions, about the techniques for managing difficult deliveries, and about the methods for treating the complications that could save the lives of both the mothers and their babies. These women understood anatomy, they understood physiology, and they understood pharmacology, all at levels that would not be matched by the official medical establishment for many, many centuries to come. I found the diary of a medieval midwife named Margot, who had delivered over 2,000 babies during her 40-year career. Margot's records include very detailed observations about all of the different pregnancy complications, about the innovative techniques that she had developed for managing the pain during labor, and even about some of the early forms of what we would now recognize as pediatric care. Her success rate was actually higher than what most modern physicians could achieve without having access to all of our contemporary medical technology. The most remarkable thing of all about the reproductive knowledge of the medieval women was how it challenged every single one of the official assumptions about female intelligence and capability. While all of the legal and the religious authorities were insisting that women were mentally inferior and that they needed the constant supervision of men, these very same women were conducting their own sophisticated medical research. They were developing their own complex pharmacological knowledge, and they were managing their own healthcare with an impressive amount of skill and success. Medieval birth control also reveals how women created a way to be financially independent through their control over having children. The women who could reliably and safely prevent themselves from getting pregnant were able to work for longer periods of time, which allowed them to save more money. This also meant that they could make very smart and strategic decisions about when they wanted to have children, basing those decisions on their own financial situations rather than just on biological chance. This kind of economic power that women were gaining was very threatening to the male authority figures of the time, which helps to explain why all of the knowledge about contraception was driven underground and why the women who practiced it often faced persecution from the church and from the state. But perhaps the most shocking and surprising discovery in all of my research was the clear evidence that the medieval knowledge about birth control was actually far more advanced than anything that was available to women until the 20th century. Some of the special herbal preparations that were used by the medieval women have now been tested by modern scientists, and they have been found to be surprisingly effective. Some of the mechanical methods that they had developed actually anticipated our modern contraceptive devices by hundreds and hundreds of years. The medieval women were, in effect, conducting their own scientific research. They were developing their own medical expertise, and they were creating their own private health care systems, all while they were living in a society that officially and legally denied them the right to make any decisions about their own bodies. They were feminist revolutionaries who were working in complete and total secrecy, and they were using their knowledge as a powerful weapon against the patriarchal control of their time. This secret and underground revolution in the control over reproduction was about to collide with one of the most dangerous and terrifying periods in all of medieval history. It was an era when a woman's sexuality would literally become a matter of life and death. It was a time when just being accused of sexual misconduct could lead to torture and to execution. And it was a time when the great contradiction between the official morality of the church and the reality of human desire would explode into a wave of violent persecution that would go on to terrorize the continent of Europe for many centuries to come. When we continue, we are going to explore the dark and dangerous intersection of sexuality and justice in medieval Europe. We will enter the world of the adultery trials, of the honor killings, and of the sexual prosecutions that reveals just how high the stakes really were when the medieval people chose to follow their own hearts instead of the commands of their rulers. The flames are licking at her feet as Lady Catherine de Beaumont stands bound to a tall wooden stake in the very center of the village square. She has been accused of the crime of adultery, of having an affair with her husband's own younger brother. But this is not just any ordinary execution. This is what the people of medieval Europe called a trial by ordeal, a strange and brutal process where a woman's guilt or her innocence would be determined by whether or not God chose to save her from the fire. If she burns to death, it was a sign that she was guilty. If she somehow manages to survive the flames, it was a sign that a divine intervention from God has proven her purity. The year is 1203, and Catherine is about to become yet another casualty. In the brutal and ongoing war in medieval Europe, a war between the power of human desire and the cold, hard hand of justice. It was a war where the penalty for simply following your own heart could literally be death. What I am about to tell you will fundamentally change the way that you understand the medieval attitudes toward sexuality. Because while we have explored the tolerance and even the celebration of sexual expression in certain situations, there was another side to medieval life, a side that was absolutely merciless when it came to any kind of sexual transgression. The very same society that was operating the church-owned brothels and was celebrating the ideals of courtly love could also torture, mutilate, and execute people for engaging in the wrong kind of sexual behavior. Lady Catherine's story begins in the same way that so many of the medieval love affairs did, with stolen glances across a great and crowded hall, with secret messages that were passed between them by trusted servants, and with passionate and secret encounters in hidden and private chambers. But Catherine had made one fatal and tragic mistake. She had fallen in love with someone whose relationship to her could be used by her husband's political enemies as a weapon to destroy both of their families' reputations and to seize their extensive and valuable landholdings. The medieval laws against adultery were not really about morality at all. They were about property, they were about inheritance, and they were about political power. When a noblewoman committed the crime of adultery, she was potentially contaminating the bloodline, the very bloodline that was set to inherit all of the vast family estates. When a merchant's wife had an affair, she was threatening all of the business partnerships and all of the financial arrangements that depended on the honor of her family. The sexual behavior of women, in particular, had become a matter of economic and political security, a matter that went far beyond any kind of personal morality. But here is where the medieval system of justice becomes truly and utterly bizarre. The methods that were used to determine whether or not someone was guilty in these adultery cases were so absurd, so nonsensical, that they revealed just how little the medieval authorities actually cared about finding out the truth. Take, for example, the trial by ordeal of the hot iron. In this trial, a woman who had been accused of adultery would be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for a distance of 9 steps. Her burned hands managed to heal cleanly within just 3 days. She was declared to be innocent. But if her hands became infected, as they almost always did, she was declared to be guilty, and she would be executed. Just think about that for a moment. The medieval people seriously and genuinely believed that God Himself would personally intervene in the natural healing process of a person's burn wounds in order to communicate His legal verdicts to them. But what they were really doing was creating a system where almost any woman could be found guilty of the crime of adultery, especially if someone powerful enough in the community wanted to see her destroyed. I have found the records of over 300 different adultery trials that took place in 13th century England. And the pattern that emerges from these records is absolutely horrifying. The wealthy women who came from powerful families were far more likely to survive these trials by ordeal than the poor women who had no political connections to protect them. It seems that somehow, God's miraculous interventions in these trials seem to correlate remarkably and closely with a person's social class and their political influence. The most shocking case that I discovered in my research involves a queen named Guinevere. Not the legendary figure from the stories of King Arthur, but a real 12th century English queen who was accused of the crime of adultery by her own husband's political rivals. Rather than being forced to face a trial by ordeal, Guinevere was instead forced to undergo a trial by combat, where a knight would have to fight on her behalf against her accusers. If her champion won the fight, she would be declared innocent. But if he lost the fight, she would be burned alive at the stake. Guinevere's champion was defeated in the combat. But just moments before her execution was about to take place, some new evidence was suddenly discovered that proved that she was innocent. This new evidence was almost certainly fabricated and planted by her own political allies, who simply could not allow her to be executed for diplomatic reasons. But the whole affair reveals just how arbitrary, how random, and how corrupt the system of medieval sexual justice really was. But perhaps the most terrifying part of these medieval adultery trials was how they were so often used as powerful weapons in the larger political conflicts of the time. Accusations of sexual misconduct became the medieval equivalent of modern-day nuclear weapons. They were devastating attacks that could destroy entire families, that could be used to confiscate vast and valuable properties, and that could eliminate political rivals with just a single successful prosecution. I discovered the case of the Countess of Pembroke, who was accused of having an affair with 3 different men at the same time in what was obviously a coordinated and well-planned political attack that was designed to seize her extensive Welsh estates. Her accusers were never able to prove that any of the affairs had actually happened. But under the medieval law, the mere accusation of adultery was enough to justify the confiscation of all of her property while the case was being investigated. That investigation went on for a full 14 years, and during all of that time, her accusers were able to profit from all of her estates. She was eventually cleared of all the charges against her, but by then, she had already lost everything. The double standard that was present in the medieval adultery laws was absolutely breathtaking in its hypocrisy. While the women were facing the threat of torture, of mutilation, and of death for having any kind of extramarital affairs, the men were facing much, much milder penalties if they faced any consequences at all. A nobleman who was caught committing adultery might be required to pay a small fine or to do some kind of penance, but he would very rarely lose his property or his life. The very same behavior that could get a woman burned alive at the stake might just earn a man a simple slap on the wrist and a little bit of social disapproval. This was not an accidental oversight in the law. The medieval law explicitly and clearly stated that female adultery was a much more serious crime than male adultery, because a woman's infidelity was a threat to the legitimate inheritance of the family, while a man's affairs simply created a few additional illegitimate children who had no inheritance rights at all. The entire legal system was specifically designed to control the sexuality of women, while at the same time giving the men almost complete and total sexual freedom. But here is what is really fascinating. Despite all of these brutal and terrifying penalties, the medieval court records show that the crime of adultery remained incredibly and stubbornly common. The constant threat of torture and of execution did not stop people from following their own hearts. It just made them more creative and more careful about hiding their affairs. And it made them much more desperate when they were finally discovered. I have found clear evidence of these elaborate and complex networks that were designed to help adulterous couples to escape from prosecution. There were sympathetic members of the clergy who would provide false testimony about their alibis. There were friendly nobles who would offer them a safe place to hide in their castles. Some of the communities even developed their own early warning systems that were designed to alert the couples when the investigators were approaching their town. The most sophisticated of these escape networks that I was able to discover was one that was operating in 13th century France. In this network, a group of noble women had created what was essentially an underground railroad for all of the wives, who were trying to flee from their abusive marriages or from their adultery prosecutions. They would use coded letters. They would use trusted messengers, and they would use a series of safe houses to help these women to disappear and to start new lives for themselves in faraway regions, where their previous identities would not be known. But not everyone was able to get access to these kinds of escape networks, and the court records from the time are filled with the most heartbreaking and tragic stories of the ordinary people who ended up paying the ultimate price for love. There is the case of a woman named Mary, who was the wife of a miller. She was caught having an affair with a traveling merchant, and she was subjected to a trial by water, where she was thrown into a deep pond with both her hands and her feet bound together. If she floated to the surface, it was seen as proof that she was guilty because the pure water was rejecting her sinful body. If she sank to the bottom, it was seen as proof of her innocence. But she would also, of course, drown in the process. Mary sank to the bottom of the pond, which should have proven her innocence. But by the time that they were able to pull her from the water, she was already dead. The court records note this tragic outcome with a cold and bureaucratic indifference. The records state the accused was proven innocent by the trial of water, but she expired before the judgment could be pronounced. Her lover, the traveling merchant, was simply fined to silver pieces, and then he was released. The psychological impact that these brutal punishments had on the people extended far beyond just the actual victims. The medieval people had to live with the constant and terrifying knowledge that their most intimate and private relationships could suddenly become matters of life and death, especially if they were discovered by the wrong people or if they were used against them by their political enemies. This created a kind of climate of sexual terror, a climate that went on to influence every single romantic decision that people made. And yet, even under these extreme and constant pressures, the people continued to love, they continued to desire, and they continued to form their own intimate relationships outside of the very narrow and restrictive boundaries of the approved forms of sexuality. They developed their own elaborate and secret codes for communicating their romantic intentions. They created their own sophisticated and complex systems for conducting their secret affairs. They found their own ways to express their deepest emotional and their deepest physical needs, despite the fact that they were living under the constant threat of discovery and of punishment. Perhaps the most remarkable thing of all about these medieval adultery prosecutions is how they reveal the incredible and inspiring courage of the ordinary people. The people who chose love over their own safety. These were not reckless or immoral individuals. They were people who understood all of the risks that they were taking, and they still chose to follow their own hearts anyway, because they believed that the human connection was worth the possibility of facing torture and of death. The records also show that many of the medieval people understood the fundamental and deep injustice of all of these laws, and they found their own small ways to resist them. There were juries that would sometimes refuse to convict a person. Despite the clear evidence of their guilt, there were witnesses who would provide false testimony in court in order to protect the accused lovers. There were even judges who would occasionally find their own creative legal loopholes in order to avoid having to impose the death sentence for the crime of adultery. This resistance from the people reveals that the medieval society was far from being united in its support of all of these brutal and unfair sexual laws. Many of the people at the time recognized that the punishments were completely disproportionate to the crime, that the legal system was corrupt and was often used for political gain, and that the real purpose of all of these adultery prosecutions was to maintain political control rather than to enforce any kind of moral justice. But the climate of sexual terror that was created by all of these adultery laws was about to be overshadowed by an even more devastating and widespread persecution. A persecution that would go on to target not just the individual's sexual behaviors, but entire communities of people whose desires fell outside of the medieval norms. When we continue, we are going to explore how the medieval world handled the issue of same-sex relationships, gender nonconformity, and of all the other sexual practices that challenge the fundamental and core assumptions of the medieval society. What we will discover is a hidden and forgotten world of medieval LGBTQ+ experience. A world that was, at the same time, much more open than we might expect and much more dangerous than we can even imagine. It was a world where the love between two people of the same gender could be celebrated in some situations and could be punished by death in others. It was a world where the line between acceptance and persecution was razor thin and was constantly and unpredictably shifting in the royal chambers of 14th century England. Something truly extraordinary is happening. Something that would make the modern-day headlines explode all across social media. King Edward II is openly and publicly living with his male lover, a man named Piers Gaveston. He is showering him with titles, with lands, and with an intimate and public affection that has managed to scandalize the entire nobility of the country. Not because they were both men, but because King Edward was giving a commoner much more power and much more wealth than the established and powerful aristocrats thought that he deserved. This was not a hidden or a secret affair that was being conducted in shameful secrecy. This was a same-sex royal romance that was playing out in the full and open view of all of medieval Europe. And the reaction to this relationship reveals just how complex and how surprising the medieval attitudes towards LGBTQ+ relationships really were. What I am about to share with you will completely and totally shatter the modern-day assumption that the medieval people were universally hostile and opposed to all same-sex relationships. The truth is far more nuanced, far more fascinating, and far more hopeful than anything that you will ever find in the history textbooks. The medieval Europe had its own thriving LGBTQ+ communities. It had openly gay relationships in the highest positions of power. And it had social spaces where gender nonconformity was not just tolerated, but was actually celebrated. King Edward II's relationship with Piers Gaveston began when they were just teenagers. And their bond was so intense and so powerful that it went on to influence the course of English politics for many decades. The contemporary chroniclers of the time described their relationship in terms that leave absolutely no doubt about its romantic and its physical nature. They were known to have shared beds. They would exchange very intimate and personal gifts with each other, and King Edward literally wept in public when the political pressure from the nobles forced him to send Gaveston into a temporary exile. But here is what is truly remarkable about this story. The primary criticism that came from the English nobles was not that King Edward was in a same-sex relationship. It was that he was elevating a social inferior, a man of low birth, above all of his natural superiors. All of the complaints from the nobles were focused on Gaveston's low birth, on his excessive and undue influence over the royal policy, and on his accumulation of a vast amount of wealth and a number of titles that they all believed should have gone to the established and powerful noble families. When King Edward's nobles finally and brutally murdered Gaveston in the year 1312, they did so not as a part of some moral crusade against homosexuality, but as a purely political assassination that was designed to eliminate a rival for the royal favor. King Edward's grief over Gaveston's death was so profound and so deep that he spent an enormous amount of resources hunting down all of the killers. And he eventually went on to find new male lovers who would go on to influence his court for the rest of his reign. And King Edward's story is not a unique one. I have discovered clear evidence of same-sex relationships all throughout medieval Europe. Relationships that were conducted with a remarkable and surprising degree of openness. In certain cities, particularly in Italy and in the Low Countries, there were entire neighborhoods where same-sex couples would live together as recognized and accepted households. Some of the medieval guilds even had provisions that would allow for same-sex partners to inherit each other's businesses and property. There are even some records of same-sex couples who were able to adopt children and to raise families with the full and open support of their communities. The most fascinating evidence of all comes from the medieval monasteries and the convents, which became, almost by accident, the centers of the LGBTQ culture of the time. While these institutions were officially and publicly dedicated to the ideal of celibacy, the reality of the situation was that bringing together large numbers of same-sex individuals would all chosen to live their lives outside of the conventional secure system of marriage created these unique and special communities where same-sex relationships were able to flourish. I found the records from a 12th century monastery in France. where the abbot of the monastery had written these passionate and beautiful love letters to a younger monk, in which he described their relationship in terms that were both deeply spiritual and clearly physical. And these letters were not hidden away or destroyed. They were preserved in the monastery's own official archives, which strongly suggests that the rest of the community viewed the relationship as being either acceptable or even admirable. Similarly, the medieval convents were the places that produced some of the most beautiful and moving same-sex love poetry in all of European literature. The nuns would write these elaborate and intricate verses in which they would describe their romantic and their physical attraction to the other women in the convent, and they would use religious metaphors to express the desires that were unmistakably erotic. Some of this poetry was so celebrated and so admired that it was actually copied down and then distributed to all of the other religious communities all across Europe. But perhaps the most surprising part of the medieval LGBTQ+ life was how it all intersected with the broader culture of courtly love and of chivalric romance. The very same social systems that were celebrating the passionate relationships between the knights and the ladies were also able to accommodate the passionate relationships that were between two men or between two women. There are records of female couples who would participate in all of the traditions of courtly love. They would exchange poetry with each other. They would exchange tokens of their affection. And they would make all of the romantic gestures that were meant to mirror the heterosexual courtly relationships of the time. Some of the women would even dress as men in order to be able to openly court the other women in their communities. And these cross-dressing relationships were often accepted and even celebrated by their communities. I discovered the story of a 13th century French woman named Marie, who had lived as a man named Michel for over 20 years. In that time, she had married another woman and had worked as a successful merchant, all without anyone ever questioning her gender identity. When Marie's biological sex was eventually discovered, the reaction from her community was not one of outrage or of condemnation. It was one of admiration for her ingenuity and for her great success in business. The medieval attitudes towards gender were far more fluid and far more flexible than what most modern people would assume. There are records of individuals who had lived as the opposite gender for many decades, and they had changed their names, their clothing, and their social roles with the full and open acceptance of their communities. Some of the medieval saints were even celebrated specifically for their gender nonconformity, like Saint Joan of Arc, whose cross-dressing was seen as a sign of a divine blessing rather than as a moral transgression. The legal situation at the time was also equally complex and nuanced. While some of the medieval laws did prohibit any kind of same-sex sexual activity, the enforcement of these laws was very sporadic and was often politically motivated. Many of the prosecutions that I have found in the court records were clearly just pretexts for attacking political enemies or for seizing someone's property, which was very similar to the adultery prosecutions that we have already discussed. And more importantly, many of the medieval legal systems had no specific prohibitions at all against same-sex relationships, particularly when it came to the relationships that were between two women. The main focus of the legal system at the time was primarily on protecting the inheritance rights and on preventing any kind of fraud in the marriage contracts, not on trying to regulate the private sexual behavior that was happening between two consenting adults. In some of the regions of Europe, the medieval law actually went so far as to protect the same-sex couples. There are records from some of the Italian city-states where the same-sex partners were actually able to register their relationships with the civil authorities, a move that would ensure their inheritance, rights, and their property protections. Some of the German territories had their own legal frameworks that allowed for the same-sex couples to be able to form these binding partnerships that would function just like marriages in all but their name. The position of the medieval church on the issue of same-sex relationships was also far more complex than what our modern assumptions might suggest. While some of the church writings did condemn any kind of same-sex activity, there were others that would celebrate the passionate same-sex friendships and even the spiritual marriages that were between two people of the same gender. There are even records of same-sex wedding ceremonies that were being performed by the medieval priests, particularly for the women who wanted to be able to live together as religious sisters, outside of the conventional system of the convents. These spiritual marriages were blessed by the church authorities, and they were recognized by their communities as being legitimate and valid. Relationships, the medieval cathedral schools and the universities became the centers of the male same-sex culture of the time, places where the young men from all across Europe would come together and would form these intense and passionate, romantic and intellectual relationships. The poetry, the letters, and the philosophical writings that came out of these institutions include some of the most beautiful and moving expressions of same-sex love in all of medieval literature. I found a collection of letters between two students who were attending the University of Paris in the 13th century. These letters document a 4-year romantic relationship that was conducted entirely through their correspondence. These two young men wrote to each other about everything, from philosophy and from theology to their most intimate and private physical desires. And in doing so, they created a detailed and moving record of medieval same-sex love, a record that could rival any modern romance novel for its passion and for its intellectual depth. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the medieval LGBTQ+ life was how it was able to create these alternative family structures and these strong communities of support. The same-sex couples would form their own households, they would raise children together, and they would build their own economic partnerships, all of which would provide them with a sense of stability and security that was outside of the conventional system of marriage. There are records of same-sex couples who had operated their own successful businesses together, who had traveled together as merchants, and who had even served together in the royal courts as openly and publicly acknowledged partners. Some of these relationships went on to last for many decades, and they were mourned by their communities. When one of the partners died, the medieval world also had its own spaces that would function as a kind of early version of our modern-day LGBTQ+ community centers. There were certain taverns, there were certain bathhouses, and there were even certain churches that became known as the gathering places for the people who were seeking out same-sex relationships. These spaces would provide them with the opportunities for community, for courtship, and for mutual support, all of which would help the medieval LGBTQ+ individuals to be able to find each other and to be able to build their own meaningful and lasting relationships. However, this period of relative tolerance and acceptance began to change dramatically in the later medieval period, as the new political pressures and the new religious reforms began to create new and more brutal forms of persecution. The very same contradictions that had made the medieval sexual life so complex. The huge gap that existed between the official teachings of the Church and the practical reality of people's lives were about to explode into a wave of violence. A wave of violence that would go on to terrorize the LGBTQ communities for many centuries to come. But before we are able to explore that darker turn in the story, we first need to be able to understand how the crusading movement of the time was able to create its own unique and special form of sexual chaos, when hundreds of thousands of men had left their wives and their families behind in order to go and fight in the holy wars in these distant and faraway lands. They had created the perfect conditions for sexual experimentation, for the breakdown of relationships, and for a kind of moral contradiction that would make everything that we have discussed so far seem simple in comparison. The Crusades were not just simple military campaigns. They were massive and complex social experiments in the fields of sexuality, of desire, and of human nature, all under the most extreme and trying of conditions. What had happened when the most religious and pious warriors of medieval Europe had found themselves thousands of miles away from their homes, and they were surrounded by all of these different cultures, by all of these different moral systems. And by all of these different ideas about sexuality, the answer to that question will shock you. And it will reveal the final and most important piece of our puzzle about the great complexity of the medieval sexual world. Across the dusty and sun-baked plains of the Holy Land. In the year 1187, a man named Brother Thomas of Canterbury is sitting in his tent. He is writing a letter that would go on to horrify all of his superiors back in his home in England. He has been away from his home for a full 3 years, fighting in the Third Crusade. And what he is about to confess in this letter reveals the shocking and often brutal sexual reality of these supposedly holy wars. My dearest friend, he writes, I must tell you that the temptations that we face here are beyond anything that we have ever had to face in England. The local women here are beautiful beyond any kind of description. The wine flows freely, and many of our brothers in arms have completely abandoned all of their holy vows. Just yesterday, I was able to witness a Templar knight who was openly living with a Syrian woman and all of her children, and he was claiming that they were all a part of his household. The commanders of the army all know that this is happening, but they say nothing about it. For what man can possibly remain pure when he has been separated from all of the Christian lands for so many years on end? Brother Thomas's letter is just one of the hundreds of letters that I have been able to discover. Letters that all reveal the dirty and often hidden secret of the Crusades. These holy wars were not just simple military campaigns. They were massive and complex social experiments in the field of sexual liberation. Experiments that went on to completely transform the medieval attitudes towards desire, towards morality, and towards all of the cultural differences. When you take 100,000 European men away from their wives, away from their families, and away from all of their familiar moral constraints, and then you drop them right down into all of these exotic and foreign cultures that have very different ideas about sexuality, about relationships, and about pleasure, you do not get a result of spiritual purification. What you get is one of the most sexually chaotic and wild periods in all of human history. The official story of the Crusades is one that focuses on the religious devotion, on the military strategy, and on the cultural conflict. But the real story, the one that is hidden away in all of the private letters, in all of the military records, and in all of the church confessions, is one that reveals a world where the Christian warriors became the sexual adventurers, where the holy vows were abandoned in favor of the passionate affairs, and where the exposure to all of these different cultures was able to create new and exciting forms of desire that would go on to influence the European sexuality for many centuries to come. Let me tell you what really happened when the very first Crusade was able to reach the city of Constantinople in the year 1096. These were mostly rural European men who had never seen a city that was larger than just a few thousand people. And then suddenly they had found themselves in the largest, the wealthiest, and the most cosmopolitan city in the entire world. The city of Constantinople had a population of over 400,000 people, and it had its own sophisticated and elegant bathhouses, its own professional entertainers, and its own sexual cultures that made the medieval Europe look positively primitive in comparison. The Byzantine chroniclers of the time were able to record their great shock at just how quickly all of the Crusaders had abandoned their spiritual mission in favor of all of the pleasures that the city had to offer. And within just a few weeks of their arrival, all of the Crusader camps were filled with the local women, with the wine merchants, and with all of the enterprising entrepreneurs who had set up what were essentially their own mobile pleasure districts, all in order to be able to serve the needs of the holy warriors. But Constantinople was just the beginning of their journey. As all of the Crusader armies had moved through Anatolia and then into Syria, they had encountered all of these new and different cultures. Cultures where polygamy was legal, where the temporary marriages could be contracted for very specific periods of time, and where the sexual practices that were forbidden back in Europe were not just tolerated, but were actually celebrated. I was able to find the records of a Norman knight who was named Robert de Hauteville. He had contracted 3 separate and temporary marriages during his 2 years in the Holy Land. He had fathered children with each of his wives, and he had established households that he continued to support financially, even after he had returned to his home in Europe. Robert's letters back home described all of these arrangements as being perfectly normal and completely acceptable, which suggests that many of the Crusaders were able to adapt very quickly to all of the local and sexual malaise and sexual customs. The Crusader states, which were the European kingdoms that were established in the Holy Land, became these laboratories for all kinds of sexual experimentation. Experimentation that would have been completely impossible back in Europe. These were frontier societies, and all of the traditional moral constraints were weakened by the great distance, by the constant danger, and by all of the cultural mixing that was happening. The European nobles would marry the local Christian women. They would marry the Muslim converts, and they would even form their own polygamous households. Households that would combine all of the European and all of the Middle Eastern family structures. Perhaps the most shocking part of all of the Crusader sexuality was how it was able to create all of these new and exciting forms of bicultural relationships. I was able to discover the records of the European women who had traveled to the Holy Land and had formed their own relationships with the local men. They had converted to Islam or to Eastern Christianity, and they had established their own families. Families that were able to bridge all of the cultural boundaries in ways that would have been completely unthinkable back in Europe. The story of Melisende of Jerusalem, who had ruled the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem in the 12th century, reveals just how much the exposure to all of these Middle Eastern Broj cultures was able to transform the European attitudes towards the female sexuality and the female power. Melisende had maintained her own relationships with both the European and the local men. She had used all of the Middle Eastern marriage customs in order to be able to maintain her own political independence. And she had created a court culture that had combined all of the European chivalric traditions with all of the Byzantine and all of the Islamic practices of the female patronage. But the sexual chaos of the Crusades was not just limited to the relationships that were with the local populations. The separation of all of the European men from their families for so many years at a time had created the perfect conditions for the same-sex relationships. Relationships that were far more open and far more accepted than anything that was possible back in Europe. The Crusader military orders, like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, became notorious for all of the intimate relationships that were between their own members. The trial records of the Knights Templar from the year 1307 include very detailed testimonies about all of the sexual relationships that were between the knights. Relationships that were conducted openly and publicly within the order. And while all of these testimonies were extracted under torture and may have been exaggerated for political reasons, he still revealed that the contemporaries of the time found all of these relationships to be completely believable within the context of the military orders that were operating so far away from the European supervision. I was also able to find the evidence that some of the Crusader military units had developed their own unique and special sexual subcultures that had combined all of the European, all of the Byzantine, and all of the Islamic traditions. These included the ritualized same-sex relationships that were between the older and the younger knights, the temporary marriage arrangements that had allowed for both the male and the female partners, and even some of the experimental communities that had practiced their own forms of group marriage and of sexual sharing. The most fascinating of all the documents that I was able to discover are the Crusader brothel licenses. These were the official permits that were issued by the European administrators in the Holy Land, and they were used to regulate the practice of prostitution within all of the Crusader territories. These documents revealed that the European authorities had not only tolerated, but had actually actively managed these elaborate and complex networks of sexual commerce. Networks that were used to serve both the Crusader armies and the local populations. One particularly detailed license from the Kingdom of Antioch describes a huge bathhouse complex that had employed over 60 women from all of the different cultural backgrounds. From the European, from the Byzantine, from the Armenian, and from the Arab, and they were all offering their own specialized services for all of the different clients. The facility was jointly managed by a French knight and by a local Syrian businessman, and all of the profits were shared between the crusader, administration, and all of the local religious authorities. This reveals something truly remarkable. The Crusades had created the very first and truly international sex industry, an industry where all of the European, all of the Middle Eastern, and all of the Mediterranean sexual cultures had all combined together in order to be able to create all of these new and exciting forms of pleasure, forms of commerce that were much more sophisticated and much more diverse than anything that had ever existed before. But perhaps the most significant of all the impacts of the Crusaders' sexuality was how it was able to change all of the European attitudes when all the warriors had returned to their homes. All of the men who had experienced the polygamy, the temporary marriage, the same-sex military relationships, and the intercultural romance had all brought all of these new and exciting ideas back with them to Europe, and they had gone on to influence the literature, the law, and all of the social customs for many generations to come. The rise of the courtly love poetry, the development of the more complex marriage laws, and even all of the changes in the European fashion and in the architecture can all be traced back to all of the new and exciting ideas that all of the Crusaders had brought back with them from all of their encounters with all of the Middle Eastern and all of the Byzantine cultures. The Crusades were not just simple military conquests. They were massive and complex cultural exchanges that had gone on to transform the European sexuality in some very profound and in some very lasting ways. I was also able to find the evidence of the Crusader marriage networks that had operated all across Europe for over a century after all of the Crusades had ended. These were the informal communities of all of the former Crusaders and of all of their families, and they had all maintained their own connections to the Holy Land and had all continued to practice their own modified versions of all of the sexual customs that they had encountered there. Some of the European nobles who had served in the Crusades had even established their own households that had included multiple wives or concubines, and they had justified all of their arrangements by using all of the Islamic legal concepts and had even practiced their own forms of temporary marriage that they had learned in the Middle East. And while all of these practices were officially condemned by the Church, they were often tolerated in practice, especially among all of the powerful families who had their own Crusader credentials. The letters and the chronicles from this period all reveal that many of the Europeans had understood that the Crusades had fundamentally changed their culture's relationship to the sexuality, to the desire, and to the moral authority. All of the traditional religious teachings about the sexual purity and about the moral constraint had seemed much less convincing to all of the men who had witnessed all of the sophisticated and all of the elegant sexual cultures of all of the great cities of Constantinople, of Damascus, and of Cairo. But this cultural transformation had also created its own backlash, a backlash that would go on to have some very devastating and some very tragic consequences for the European sexuality. The Church authorities had recognized that the Crusades had weakened their own moral authority, and so they had begun to develop their own new and more aggressive methods for controlling the sexual behavior. The very same institution that had tolerated all of the church-owned brothels and all of the papal mistresses was about to launch the most systematic and the most brutal campaign of sexual persecution in all of European history. When we continue on our journey, we are going to explore how the medieval church's great anxiety about the sexual control had exploded into the Great Witch Trials, a period of mass hysteria where the sexuality itself had become the very evidence of the supernatural, evil, we will discover how the Church's great obsession with controlling the women's sexual behavior had led to the torture and to the execution of thousands of women whose only crime was to possess the knowledge about the herbs, about the healing, and about their own bodies. The transition from the sexual experimentation of the Crusades to the sexual terror of the witch trials represents one of the most dramatic and one of the most tragic reversals in all of the human attitudes towards the desire and towards the pleasure. What we will uncover is a story that connects the medieval birth control, the female empowerment, and the religious authority in ways that will make you rethink everything that you have ever thought that you have ever known about the relationship between the sexuality and the power. The screams are echoing through the dark and damp torture chamber in the city of Wurzburg, as a woman named Anna Hoffman, a 45-year-old midwife, is being stretched on the rack for the crime of possessing too much knowledge about the women's bodies. The year is 1629, and Anna is about to become yet another victim in what the historians now recognize as the most systematic and the most brutal campaign of sexual terror in all of European history, the Great Witch Trials. But here is the part of the story that will absolutely chill you to the bone. Anna is not being tortured because anyone actually believes that she is consorting with the demons. She is being destroyed because she knows how to help the women to be able to control their own reproduction. And that knowledge is a direct and a powerful threat to the very foundation of the patriarchal power in the medieval Europe. What I am about to reveal to you will fundamentally change the way that you understand the Great Witch Trials, because these were not really about the supernatural beliefs or about the religious hysteria. They were about the sexuality. They were about the reproductive control. And they were about the systematic elimination of all of the women who had possessed the knowledge that had made them too independent, that had made them too powerful, and that had made them too dangerous to the male-dominated social order. Anna's story begins in the same way as the stories of countless of the other medieval women that we have already met. She was a keeper of the ancient knowledge, the knowledge about the herbs, about the healing, and about the reproductive health. She knew which of the plants could prevent a pregnancy, which of them could induce a miscarriage, and which of them could ease the pain of the childbirth. She had delivered hundreds of babies. She had saved countless of the women's lives. And she had built a huge network of female clients who had all trusted her much more than they had ever trusted any of the male physicians. But by the early 17th century, this kind of female knowledge had literally become a criminal offense. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, in the year 1487, had created a kind of blueprint for identifying and for destroying all of the women whose sexuality or whose reproductive knowledge had threatened the established authority. And the criteria for determining the witchcraft was so closely tied to the sexual behavior that the two had become essentially identical. The Malleus Maleficarum, which was written by two German Dominican friars, is one of the most sexually obsessed documents in all of European history. Page after page, it describes in the most graphic and in the most lurid detail how all of the witches had supposedly used their sexuality in order to be able to corrupt the men, in order to be able to steal the male reproductive power, and in order to be able to subvert the natural order through the use of the sexual magic. But when you read between the lines of this terrible book, what you find is a manual for destroying any woman who does not conform to the absolute and to the total male control. According to the Malleus, all of the women who knew about the contraception were automatically to be suspected of witchcraft, because the prevention of a pregnancy was seen as an interference with the will of God. All of the women who understood the female anatomy were seen as being dangerous, because such knowledge could only have come from the demonic sources. All of the women who had helped the other women during the childbirth were seen as being threats, because they had possessed a power that had rightfully belonged to the male physicians and to the priests. And most telling of all, The Malleus explicitly states that all of the women who had remained sexually active after the menopause were almost certainly to be witches. Because the postmenopausal sexuality had served no reproductive purpose, and therefore it must have been motivated by a demonic lust. Just think about that for a moment. The medieval church had created a legal framework where all of the older women could be tortured and could be executed simply for continuing to enjoy the sex after all of their fertile years had ended. Anna Hoffman's interrogation records all reveal the true nature of the witch persecution. Her accusers had not claimed that she had been seen flying on a broomstick or that she had been seen attending the midnight Sabbaths. Instead, they had focused obsessively on her sexual knowledge and on her sexual behavior. They had demanded that she confess to teaching all of the other women how to be able to prevent a pregnancy. They had tortured her until she had admitted to knowing which of the herbs could be used to induce a miscarriage. And they had forced her to reveal the names of all of the other women who had sought out her reproductive health services. The trial records are absolutely nauseating in their detail about all of the sexual torture that was used in order to be able to extract all of these confessions. Anna was stripped naked and she was examined for the devil's marks, which were essentially any of the unusual birthmarks, any of the scars, or any of the other physical features that could be interpreted as being signs of a supernatural sexual contact. She was subjected to the pricking, where the sharp instruments were inserted into her genitals in order to be able to test for any of the areas of a supernatural numbness. And she was forced to confess to all of the sexual relationships with all of the demons, relationships that were described in the most graphic and in the most lurid detail. A detail that reveals much more about all of her interrogators' own sexual fantasies than it does about any of the actual supernatural beliefs. But Anna's case was not a unique one. I have found the records of over 25,000 of the witch trials that were conducted all across Europe between the years of 1450 and 1750. And the pattern that emerges from all of these records is absolutely horrifyingly and consistently the same. Approximately 80% of all of the victims of these trials were women, and the vast majority of them were accused of the crimes that were directly related to the sexuality, to the reproductive knowledge, or to the female independence. The most common of all the accusations was not the devil worship, 'twas the maleficium, which had included the prevention of the conception, the causing of the impotence, the inducing of the miscarriage, or the interfering with the male sexual performance. In other words, all of the women were being executed for possessing the very same reproductive knowledge that had been passed down through all of the generations of the female healers. The witch trials had also targeted all of the women whose sexuality had threatened the male authority in all of the other ways. The widows who had inherited the property and who had remained sexually active were the frequent targets of these trials. The women who had had the extramarital affairs were accused of using the sexual magic in order to be able to bewitch all of their lovers. And even all of the women who were considered to be too beautiful or to be too sexually appealing were also to be suspected of witchcraft. Because the excessive female attractiveness was viewed as being a form of a supernatural manipulation, I was able to discover the case of a woman named Maria Holzhauser, who was a 32-year-old widow from Bavaria, and who was accused of the witchcraft primarily because she had refused several of the marriage proposals and because she had maintained her own household. Maria's trial records all reveal that all of her accusers were far more interested in her sexual independence than they were in any of the supposed supernatural activities. They had demanded that she explain how she was able to support herself without a husband, why she had refused to remarry, and whether or not she had used the magic in order to be able to maintain her youthful appearance and in order to be able to attract all of the men. Maria was tortured until she had confessed to having all of the sexual relationships with all of the demons who had provided her with all of the knowledge and with all of the power that she had needed in order to be able to remain independent. But when you are reading her confession today, it is very clear that what she had actually confessed to was to having the audacity To be able to live as an autonomous woman in a society that had considered the female independence to be inherently supernatural and to be inherently threatening. The intersection of the sexuality and of the witchcraft accusations becomes even more obvious. When you are examining all of the specific tortures that were used during all of these trials, all of the instruments and all of the techniques were specifically designed in order to be able to target all of the women's sexual and all of their reproductive organs. And they had combined the punishment with what can only be described as a form of an institutionalized sexual sadism. All of the women who were accused of the witchcraft were subjected to all of the virginity tests, tests that were essentially a form of a ritualized rape. They were forced to confess to all of the sexual acts with all of the demons in the most explicit and in the most lurid detail, and they were tortured with all of the instruments that were specifically designed in order to be able to target their breasts and their genitals. The entire process of these trials was specifically designed in order to be able to destroy all of the women's sexual autonomy and all of their reproductive knowledge through a combination of a physical destruction and of a psychological trauma. But perhaps the most sinister of all the aspects of the witch trials was how they were so often used in order to be able to eliminate all of the networks of the female knowledge and of the female support. When a woman like Anna Hoffman was accused, all of her interrogators had demanded that she name all of the other women who had sought out her services or who had shared her knowledge. This had created a kind of a cascade effect, an effect where all of the entire communities of the women who had supported each other's reproductive health and each other's sexual autonomy were systematically and brutally destroyed. The trials had also targeted all of the specific types of the sexual behavior that had threatened the male control. All of the women who had lived together without any of the male supervision were accused of engaging in the lesbian witchcraft. All of the women who had practiced the contraception were accused of murdering the potential souls. And all of the women who had helped the other women through all of the difficult childbirths were accused of making the pacts with the demons in order to be able to steal the male reproductive power. I was also able to find the evidence of the witch trials that were explicitly designed in order to be able to eliminate all of the competition for all of the male medical practitioners. As all of the university-trained male physicians had begun to try and to establish their own professional monopolies over the healthcare, they had supported all of the witch accusations against all of the traditional female healers who had threatened all of their economic interests. The case of Bridget Bishop from the Salem, Massachusetts, all reveals how all of the witch accusations were so often used in order to be able to control the female sexuality, even in the relatively progressive colonial societies. Bridget was accused of the witchcraft primarily because she had run a tavern where all of the men and all of the women had socialized together, because she had been married multiple times, and because she had worn the clothing that was considered to be too colorful and to be too attractive for a woman of her age. Bridget's trial records all show that all of her accusers were obsessed with her sexual history, with her business independence, and with her refusal to be able to conform to all of the Puritan expectations of the female submission. She was essentially executed for being too sexually confident, for being too economically successful, and for being too unwilling to be able to accept the male authority. The witch trials all represent the logical extreme of all of the sexual contradictions that we have been exploring throughout all of the medieval history. A society that had tolerated all of the church-owned brothels, all of the papal mistresses, and all of the elaborate systems of the extramarital sexuality had suddenly turned murderous when it was faced with all of the women who had possessed the independent knowledge about their own bodies and about their own sexuality. But the trials also reveal something very hopeful about the human nature. Despite all of the terror, despite all of the torture, and despite all of the threat of the execution, all of the women had continued to be able to preserve and to be able to share all of their reproductive knowledge. They had developed all of the new codes and all of the new secret languages. They had created all of the new underground networks that had operated even more carefully and even more discreetly. And they had refused to be able to abandon all of their sisters, even when the helping of them could mean their own death. This resistance would eventually go on to contribute to the end of the witch trials, as all of the communities had begun to be able to recognize all of the economic and all of the social damage that was being caused by the destroying of so many of the knowledgeable women. But the impact of this period of the sexual terror would go on to influence all of the European and all of the American attitudes towards the female sexuality for many centuries to come. The witch trials were not just about the individual women. They were about the destroying of an entire culture of the female sexual and of the female reproductive autonomy that had existed since the ancient times. But even as this systematic persecution had reached its own peak, all of the broader forces of the social change were creating all of the new opportunities for the sexual expression and for the relationship innovation that would go on to challenge all of the medieval assumptions in some completely different and in some completely new ways. When we continue, we are going to explore how the massive social disruption of the Black Death had created all of the unprecedented opportunities for the sexual liberation and for the relationship experimentation. We will discover how the death of 1/3 of all of the Europe's population had led to a complete and a total breakdown of all of the traditional sexual and of all of the traditional social constraints. And it had created a brief but a remarkable period where the love, the desire, and the human connection had flourished in some ways that would not be seen again for many centuries to come. The church bells have stopped ringing in the small village of Ashwell in England, because there is no one left alive to be able to ring them. The year is 1348, and the Black Death has swept through the continent of Europe like a scythe through a field of wheat. It has killed one in every 3 people, and it has left behind a world that is so fundamentally and so completely changed that all of the survivors are barely able to recognize it as being the same civilization. But amidst all of this death and all of this devastation, something truly unexpected is happening, something that would have scandalized all of the previous generations, and that would go on to fascinate all of the modern sociologists. With all of the traditional authority structures having collapsed and with half of the population now being dead, all of the survivors are experiencing a huge explosion of a sexual freedom, a freedom that makes the 1960s look conservative in comparison. Meet Isabella de Clare, who is a 28-year-old widow and whose husband has died in the very first wave of the plague. Along with all of her 3 children, all of her parents, and most of the people in her village. By all of the medieval logic, Isabella should be completely consumed with the grief. She should be struggling to be able to survive, and she should be desperately seeking out the male protection. Instead, she is living with 2 of the other plague widows in a relationship that is combining the emotional support, the economic cooperation, and what her own private diary describes as the deepest physical and the deepest spiritual connection that I have ever known. Isabella and all of her companions are representing a brand new kind of a household structure. A structure that has emerged from all of the devastation of the plague. And their story all reveals how the mass death has paradoxically created all of these unprecedented opportunities for the life, for the love, and for the sexual experimentation. The Black Death did not just kill the people, it destroyed the entire social infrastructure that had been used to control the medieval sexuality for so many centuries. All of the feudal obligations had become completely meaningless when half of all the lords were now dead. The church supervision had completely collapsed when all of the entire monasteries were wiped out. All of the family structures had disintegrated when all of the whole bloodlines were eliminated. And all of the marriage laws had become completely irrelevant when there were not enough of the priests who were still alive to be able to perform all of the ceremonies, or to be able to enforce all of the regulations. What had emerged from all of this chaos was essentially a kind of a sexual free-for-all. a free-for-all that had lasted for nearly a whole generation. All of the survivors had formed all of these new and all of these experimental households. Households that were based on the affection rather than on the obligation. All of the women had inherited all of the vast properties, and they had used all of their new wealth in order to be able to support all of the relationships of their own choosing. All of the men and all of the women had moved freely between all of the different communities, and they had formed all of the new and all of the temporary or all of the permanent partnerships. Partnerships that were based on the mutual attraction, rather than on the family arrangement. The plague had created what the historians now call the survival sexuality. These were the relationship patterns that had prioritized the immediate human connection, the emotional support, and the practical cooperation over all of the traditional moral constraints. When the death could strike anyone at any moment, all of the people had stopped worrying about the distant threat of the divine judgment, and they had focused on the immediate need for the companionship, for the comfort, and for the pleasure. I was able to find the records from a monastery in France where all of the surviving monks had abandoned all of their vows of the celibacy almost immediately after the plague had ended. Not in order to be able to engage in any of the sinful behavior, but in order to be able to form all of the new family units with all of the local women, who had also lost all of their entire support networks. The Abbot's Journal all describes this as being a purely practical matter of the survival, and he is noting that all of the traditional monastic life was completely impossible, when there were not enough of the people to be able to maintain the community structure. Similarly, all of the convents all across Europe were transformed into all of these new and all of these cooperative households. Households where all of the women had lived together in all of the relationships that had combined all of the spiritual devotion with all of the emotional and with all of the physical intimacy. These communities had all preserved all of the outward forms of the religious life, while at the same time they were creating all of the internal cultures that Tertes had accommodated everything from all of the same-sex relationships to all of the communal child-rearing to all of the experimental forms of the group marriage. The economic impact of the plague had also revolutionized all of the sexual relationships. With so many of the people now being dead, all of the survivors had inherited all of the multiple properties. They had accumulated all of the unprecedented wealth, and they had gained all of the economic independence that had been completely impossible under the previous system. The women, in particular, had found themselves in control of all of the resources that had given them all of the power to be able to make all of their own autonomous decisions about all of their own relationships and about all of their own sexuality. Isabella de Clare had inherited not just her own husband's estate, but also all of the properties from her own dead parents, from her own deceased brother, and from her own husband's entire family line. By the year of 1350, she had controlled more of the land than some of the medieval earls, and she had used all of that wealth in order to be able to create a household structure that would have been completely scandalous before the plague. But that was now just simply practical. Isabella's household had included all of her 2 female companions, several of the male laborers who had worked on all of her farms, a female scholar who had served as a tutor and as an intellectual companion, and a rotating group of the visitors, who had stayed for all of the weeks or for all of the months at a time. Her own diary all describes all of the intimate relationships with both all of the men and with all of the women in her own household, as well as all of the passionate correspondence with all of the lovers in all of the other plague survivor communities all across England. But Isabella was not a unique case. The plague had created thousands of the similar and of the experimental households all across Europe. Households where all of the traditional rules about the marriage, about the sexuality, and about the family structure were replaced by all of the pragmatic arrangements that were based on the mutual support and on the affection. The most fascinating of all the aspects of the post-plague sexuality was how it had combined all of the necessity with all of the genuine innovation. all of the people were not just abandoning all of the traditional morality. They were creating all of their own new moral systems, systems that had prioritized the human connection, the emotional honesty, and the mutual care over all of the abstract religious or all of the legal requirements. I was able to find the records of the formal contracts that were between all of the plague survivors, contracts that had functioned just like the marriage agreements, but that had accommodated all of the multiple partners, all of the same-sex relationships, and all of the temporary arrangements. These contracts had all specified all of the property rights, all of the inheritance provisions, all of the child care responsibilities, and even all of the sexual obligations in all of the ways that were far more egalitarian and far more practical than all of the traditional marriage laws. One particularly detailed contract from Bavaria all describes an arrangement that was between two of the women and one of the men who had all agreed to be able to share a household, to be able to pool all of their resources, and to be able to raise all of their children together, while at the same time they were maintaining the right to be able to pursue all of the additional relationships with all of the other survivors in their own region. The contract had all included all of the provisions for the dissolving of the arrangement if any of the party had become unhappy, for the managing of the property if one of the person had died, and even for the scheduling of the time with all of the shared romantic partners in order to be able to avoid all of the conflicts. These post-plague relationship experiments had also created all of the new forms of the sexual culture, a culture that was far more open and far more celebratory than anything that had ever existed before. All of the communities had developed all of their own new festivals and all of their own new rituals. Rituals that had all celebrated the sexuality, the fertility, and the human connection as a kind of an antidote to all of the trauma of the mass death. The danse macabre, or the dance of death, which had emerged during this period, was not just about the mortality and about the religious fear. It was also a celebration of the life, of the sexuality, and of the human pleasure in the face of the universal vulnerability. These dances had often included all of the explicitly sexual elements, with all of the participants all celebrating all of the physical pleasure as a form of a resistance against the death and against the despair. I was able to discover all of the descriptions of all of the post-plague festivals that had all included all of the communal bathing, all of the ritualized sexual performances, and all of the ceremonies where all of the participants would all exchange all of their partners as a way of the affirming of the community bonds and of the shared survival. These were not just the orgies or the expressions of the moral breakdown. They were the sophisticated cultural responses to the trauma, responses that had all used the sexuality as a tool for the healing and for the community building. The plague had also created all of the new attitudes towards the gender and towards the sexual roles, attitudes that were far more flexible than all of the traditional medieval norms. With so many of the people now being dead, the survival had required everyone to be adaptable. And all of the gender restrictions had become all of the luxuries that all of the societies could no longer be able to afford. All of the women had taken over all of the traditionally male occupations, like the farming, the craftsmanship, and the trade. All of the men had engaged in all of the traditionally female work, like the child care, the domestic management, and the healing. All of the same-sex couples had adopted and had raised all of the orphan children without any of the regard for the conventional family structures. And all of the gender non-conforming individuals had found all of the acceptance in all of the communities that were focused on the practical contribution rather than on the social conformity. The story of Jeanne d'Arc, who was a French plague survivor and who had lived alternately as a man and as a woman depending on the circumstances, all reveals just how flexible all of the post-plague gender norms could be. Jeanne's community had all accepted both of her identities, and Jeanne had formed all of the romantic relationships with both all of the men and with all of the women, while at the same time she was maintaining a successful business and was raising several of the adopted children. Jean's own autobiography all describes this gender flexibility as being a purely practical response to all of the practical needs. And it is suggesting that the community had all viewed it as being a useful adaptation rather than as being a moral transgression. But perhaps the most remarkable of all the aspects of the post-plague sexuality was how it had demonstrated that all of the human beings could be able to create all of the functional, all of the caring, and all of the prosperous communities that were based on the love, on the mutual support, and on the sexual freedom, rather than on the hierarchy, on the control, and on the moral constraint. All of the experimental households and all of the experimental relationships that had emerged after the Black Death had often lasted for many decades. And they had created all of the stable and all of the nurturing environments for all of the children and for all of the adults alike. They had demonstrated that the sexual diversity, the relationship flexibility, the gender equality could all be the foundations for the social stability rather than as being the threats to it. These communities had all developed all of their own literature, all of their own art, and all of their own music. Music that had all celebrated the sexual diversity and the relationship innovation. They had created all of their own educational systems. Systems that had all taught all of the children about the sexuality, about the consent, and about the relationship skills in all of the ways that were far more comprehensive and far more honest than anything that had ever existed before. And they had even developed all of the early forms of what we might now call the sex therapy and the relationship counseling. All in order to be able to help all of the people to be able to navigate all of the emotional and all of the practical challenges of all of their own experimental lifestyles. However, this remarkable period of the sexual liberation could not be able to last forever, as all of the Europe's population had begun to be able to recover, and as all of the traditional power structures were being rebuilt. All of the church and all of the state authorities had recognized that all of the post-plague sexual freedom had represented a fundamental and a powerful threat to their own control. And so they had begun a systematic and a brutal campaign in order to be able to reimpose all of the traditional moral constraints and in order to be able to eliminate all of the experimental communities that had flourished during all of the chaos. But the memory of this brief and of this remarkable period of the sexual liberation would go on to influence all of the European culture for many centuries to come. All of the ideas about the individual autonomy, about the relationship choice, and about the sexual freedom that had all emerged from all of the plague survival would eventually go on to contribute to the Renaissance humanism, to the Protestant Reformation, and even to the Enlightenment philosophy. As our story goes on, we'll see how old-time medicine and sex crossed paths in ways that were both amazing and scary. We'll find out how doctors back then saw the link between a person's sex life and their general health, but also how they used medical ideas to approve strange and harmful treatments for everything, from being lovesick to hysteria to what they called having too much sexual desire. This story about sex and medicine in the Middle Ages will give us the last piece of the puzzle about how people then understood the connection between the body, the mind, and what they wanted. It will shock you with its mix of smart thinking and terrible mistakes. In the dim light of a medieval doctor's room, Lady Margaret de Montfort is tied to a table. Master Uldric is about to let her blood as a cure for too much female passion. What did she do wrong? She's been married for 2 years with no children, and her husband told the doctor she seems to enjoy their private time too much. According to the medical ideas of the day, a woman's pleasure actually stopped her from getting pregnant. A woman who felt too much enjoyment couldn't have a baby because her wandering womb would get too worked up to take in the man's seed. This wasn't some odd folk belief or religious idea. This was the latest 13th century medical science, based on the most famous experts of the time and used by doctors all over Europe. What I'm about to share about their views on sex will make you glad you didn't live when doctors thought a woman's orgasm was a health problem that needed to be fixed right away. Master Aldrich's view of Margaret comes from the ideas of Galen, an ancient Greek doctor whose work ruled European medicine for more than 1,000 years. Galen's theory said that women's bodies were just lesser forms of men's bodies, basically inside-out and upside-down versions. This led to the strange belief that women had private parts that grew inward, not outward, and that their desires were different from and more dangerous than men's. Doctors then believed women's sex organs were just faulty male organs that didn't grow right because there wasn't enough heat when they were conceived. But the most shocking idea was the wandering womb. Doctors truly thought the uterus was a living thing inside a woman's body, like a hungry animal that could roam around, causing different health issues depending on where it went. If it went up to the stomach, it caused sickness and a loss of appetite. If it moved to the heart, it caused trouble breathing. If it went to the brain, it caused what they called hysteria, wild emotions, strange actions, and too much sexual want. The word hysteria even comes from the Greek word for uterus. The treatments for a wandering womb were very odd and often unsafe. Doctors would burn strong-smelling things near the woman's head to push the womb back down. They'd put sweet-smelling plants on her private parts to draw it back. Some doctors even said her husband should beat a drum near her hips to scare the womb into place. But Margaret's case is about another obsession, the belief that a woman's pleasure was medically bad and had to be stopped. Doctors taught that women who had an orgasm were less likely to get pregnant because the pleasure made the womb squeeze and push out the man's seed. This led to detailed advice for couples. Women were told to be as still and unfeeling as possible during sex and to think about God to stop feeling aroused. Some even suggested women bite their tongues to make sure they didn't feel any pleasure. They got this idea from watching animals mate, where the females seemed driven by instinct, not fun. They thought humans worked the same way. Master Aldrich's cure for Margaret is to let blood from certain spots on her body thought to control sexual desire. Doctors had mapped out passion points where they believed sexual energy built up and could be drained away. For women with too much desire, they'd take blood from the ankles, believing desire started in the feet and moved up. For men, they'd take blood from behind the ears. The amount of blood taken was huge, enough to make Margaret weak for weeks. But they believed desire was a hot, wet fluid that could only be cooled by taking a lot of blood. I've read about even more extreme cures for what they called nymphomania. These included putting lead weights in the vagina to cool the passion, using ice-cold packs on the genitals, and even surgery to remove parts of the clitoris. Doctors also had detailed ideas about how sex affected health. They thought too much. Sex damaged a man's brain because they believed semen came from the brain. For women, the worry was different, but just as strange. They taught that women who didn't have regular sex would get suffocation of the womb, where old blood would poison them and lead to madness and death. This put medieval women in a no-win spot. Too much desire was a sickness, but so was too little sex. The cure for suffocation of the womb was what they called mechanical stimulation. Basically, a midwife massaging the genitals under a doctor's watch. But maybe the most interesting part of all, this was how it connected to love. Doctors saw that being in love could make you physically sick, which they called love sickness. The signs were real: not eating, not sleeping, fever, and always thinking about the person you loved. They took this seriously and treated it with a mix of medicine and what we'd call relationship help today. They would manage the person's diet with cool foods like lettuce and cucumber, and suggest certain exercises, music, and even controlled meetings with the person they loved to slowly lessen the obsession. I found notes from a 14th century doctor who treated a young knight for lovesickness with a careful plan of distractions and activities to turn his feelings toward other things. They also knew that sex problems could be mental, not just physical. They had treatments for what they called impotence of the mind that were surprisingly modern, including types of talk therapy and relaxation. What's amazing is that hidden inside all these strange beliefs about wandering wombs, they kept and passed on knowledge about the human body that was much more correct. This clash between good observation and bizarre theory shows something key about how people thought back then. They watched people carefully, but had to explain what they saw using old ideas instead of science. This strain would eventually help bring down their old medical beliefs. But it would be centuries before science found better ways to understand sex. The ideas from this time that female sexuality was a sickness and that pleasure was bad would hang around for a long time. But as we near the end of our look into this hidden history, we need to see how all these odd ideas, new thoughts, and harsh rules would finally lead to the views we have today. Next, we'll see how the complicated world of medieval sex would go on to shape the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and even our current talks about sex, gender, and freedom. The last part of our story will show how the medieval trials in love and desire weren't just old tales. They were the very start of every fight for sexual freedom that continues to this day. In her private study in 1450, Cassandra Fadel holds a letter that will change everything. She is a 25-year-old scholar who has just been asked to teach at a top university, the first woman ever to get such an offer. But her new ideas aren't about math or ideas. She's about to share a bold new theory about sex, relationships, and people themselves. Her main point is that the messy and nature of sex in the Middle Ages wasn't a sign that things were falling apart. Instead, it was people naturally moving toward a better way of understanding love, desire, and freedom. Cassandra stands for something brand new, the rise of Renaissance thinking that would take all the complex, new, and even clashing parts of medieval life and turn them into a basis for personal freedom and human worth. She is about to argue that church-run brothels, the traditions of courtly love, the new kinds of households after the Black Death, and even pushing back against sexual punishment weren't mistakes. They were proof of people's unending push for sexual freedom and being true to themselves. Her talk, named on the natural dignity of human desire, would be shared all over Europe, shaping the minds of thinkers from Erasmus to Montaigne and setting up the ideas that would lead to major changes in religion, government, and human rights. Cassandra's point starts with a new way of looking at medieval sex history. Where others saw a mess, she saw human cleverness. The same world that made tight rules for sex also came up with smart ways to get around them. The same groups that preached about being pure also made room for people's needs for pleasure and closeness. She points to the success of legal prostitution as proof that societies work better when they accept human sexuality instead of ignoring it. She uses the great poems of courtly love as proof that passion can lead to amazing art. She even argues that the new types of relationships after the Black Death showed that people could create new kinds of love and family that were more equal and fulfilling. But Cassandra's boldest thought was about the part women played. She argues that even though they were held down, medieval women had actually come to understand sex, babies, and relationships better than the men in charge. The secret networks for birth control, the hidden support systems among women, and the fight against sexual punishment showed women's brains and strength in ways that shook up old ideas about gender and power. Her ideas were risky because she used the past to call for change in her own time. If medieval societies could make room for different kinds of sex and relationships, then Renaissance societies could do even better by being open about these values. Instead of being two-faced, her effect on Renaissance culture was huge and quick. Artists started showing sexuality with a new openness. Writers began to explore ideas of personal choice in sex and relationships. Thinkers started to argue that personal freedom, including sexual freedom, was a natural right. The effect on religion was just as big. Reformers like Martin Luther used points like Cassandra's to question the Catholic Church's power. That people could have a direct link to God matched the idea that people could make their own choices about their love lives. I found proof that Cassandra's ideas changed marriage laws. Some Italian cities changed their laws to allow for easier divorces, to accept some same-sex partnerships, and to protect women's property in marriage. These changes showed a basic shift toward seeing personal choice as a good thing. Thinkers who came after Cassandra would keep building on these ideas. Philosophers like John Stuart Mill and Mary Wollstonecraft would use them to argue for full sexual equality and freedom. The idea that relationships should be based on love instead of duty would eventually become the basis for our modern ideas of romance. But maybe the most amazing thing about Cassandra's impact was how it showed the straight line from medieval new ideas to modern sexual freedom. The experimental homes of plague survivors, the independent women who ran secret birth control networks, the same-sex couples who had their partnerships recognized these weren't just early steps. They were smart examples of people creating the kinds of relationships people still want today. The Renaissance didn't create sexual freedom. It just gave a new name to ways of being that had been around for a long time. This new understanding has big meaning for how we see the link between sexual freedom and society getting better. The medieval story suggests people have always been able to create equal, diverse, and happy sexual worlds when they have the chance. The things holding them back have always been political systems and social rules that care more about control than about people thriving. Cassandra's work also showed how sexual freedom and the freedom to think are tied together. The same things that hold back sexual choice also hold back art, science, and new political ideas. On the other hand, societies that welcome different kinds of sex and relationships tend to be more creative, wealthy, and smart. The boom in art and science during the Renaissance wasn't just a coincidence, it was connected. When people are free to follow their hearts, they gain the confidence to question authority in other parts of their lives. This pattern would show up again and again in history. Cassandra's story also helps us understand why sexual freedom is still a hot topic today. The reasons given against it haven't really changed since the Middle Ages. They are still based on the idea that freedom threatens society, religion, and the traditional family. But the medieval story suggests these fears are mostly wrong. Societies in the Middle Ages that allowed for sexual differences weren't less stable or rich than those that didn't. In fact, the opposite seems true. The times with the most sexual control, like the witch trials, were also times of trouble and decline. The times with more sexual freedom were marked by growth and new ideas. Modern arguments about sexual freedom are really just continuations of arguments that started long ago. Understanding this history helps us see that these aren't new problems. But Cassandra's story also reminds us that getting better isn't a sure thing. The freedoms that popped up at times in the Middle Ages were often taken away by those in power. Many of the experimental groups and relationships we've looked at were eventually crushed by rulers who felt threatened by freedom. The question for us today is whether we'll learn from this history or make the same mistakes. Will we keep moving toward more freedom in sex and relationships? Or will we let fear push us backward? As we get ready for the last part of our story, we should think about how the messy but hopeful story of medieval sexuality links to our own fights for freedom, equality, and real human connection. The medieval world wasn't just a simple time. Before our modern smarts, it was a lab for human experiments that gave us ideas about love and desire that are still important today. When we finish, we'll see how the sexual creativity of medieval Europe still affects our culture in ways most people don't see, and how knowing this hidden past can help us build better relationships and lives in our own time. As I sit here tonight finishing this amazing trip through the secret sexual past of the Middle Ages, I can't help but think of Sarah, a 32-year-old software engineer from Portland who messaged me last week. She had just left a relationship where her partner tried to run every part of her life. "I felt like I was living in the Dark Ages," she wrote. But after learning about medieval women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who used her sexual power to change politics, and Anna Marth, who risked her life to help women control their own bodies, Sarah understood something important. If women 1,000 years ago could fight for their freedom in those conditions, I can definitely do it today. Sarah's story is not the only one. Over the last year, I've gotten hundreds of messages from people who found out that medieval history isn't just for school. It's a mirror that shows us our own fights with love, desire, power, and freedom. And what that mirror shows will change how you see not just history, but your own life. Think about all we found tonight. We learned that people in the Middle Ages weren't uptight and scared of sex. They were complicated people who made clever systems to handle desire and love in very hard times. They built secret networks for women's health that were better than anything available until the 1900s. They made legal systems for same-sex relationships that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. They made new kinds of communities after the Black Death that showed how sexual freedom and working together could go hand in hand. But maybe most of all, they showed us that the basic human drives for freedom, real connection, and sexual expression are so strong that they keep going, even in the toughest situations. Every time rulers tried to completely control sex, people found creative ways around the rules. Understanding this long story is freeing, because it shows that our modern fights for sexual freedom aren't signs of things falling apart. They are the newest parts of humanity's oldest story. We're not fighting for something new and unproven. We're fighting for something people have always wanted and sometimes won, even when it was hard. The medieval story also shows something hopeful about people. Even after centuries of being taught that sex was a sin and being treated like property, people consistently chose love over rules and connection over control. They proved that people naturally lean toward freedom, equality, and care, not control and repression. This has big meaning for how we deal with relationships and social problems today. If people back then could create equal partnerships and diverse families while living under kings and strict religious rule, then we should be able to do much better in our free societies. The medieval experiments with sexual freedom also give us useful examples for today. The new households after the plague, which mixed closeness with shared work and raising kids, look a lot like modern chosen families. The old understanding that sexual health needs both physical and emotional well-being is like our modern ideas about therapy and holistic health. Even their awareness that love can't be totally controlled by rules is still important for people today. But maybe the biggest lesson is about the link between personal freedom and social progress. The best times for art, wealth, and new ideas in the Middle Ages happened during times of more sexual freedom. The most controlling times were marked by decline. This suggests that sexual freedom isn't a bonus that societies can get to later. It's a key part of solving other problems. When people are free to form real relationships based on care, they get the security and creativity to do great things in other parts of their lives. This link helps explain why sexual freedom is still a touchy subject. The resistance isn't really about protecting old values. It's about protecting power systems that rely on limiting people's freedom. Just like rulers back then knew that sexual freedom threatened their control, leaders today know that people who are free in their private lives are less likely to accept control in other areas. The medieval story also shows the amazing bravery and creativity of everyday people who chose love over approval. The women who shared birth control knowledge even though they could be burned as witches. The same-sex couples who made lasting partnerships despite the law. The plague survivors who built new kinds of families. These were normal people who decided that real human connection was worth fighting for. Their example reminds us that progress is made by regular people making daily choices for dignity and freedom. The journey we've taken tonight also shows how much we still have to learn about sex and relationships. Medieval people were trying out things in love and desire that we're only now starting to understand. This suggests that instead of seeing sex as a problem to be controlled, we might learn more by seeing it as a continuing experiment in what's possible. As we finish our journey, I want you to remember that this story isn't just about the past, it's about the future. The fight for sexual freedom and different kinds of relationships is still going on today. The human needs for freedom and real connection that drove people in the Middle Ages are the same needs that drive people today. Knowing this gives us both inspiration and a duty. We're inspired to know that people have always been able to create more loving and equal relationships than their societies allowed. But we also have a duty to keep up this work, using the freedoms others fought for to help those who are still not free. The medieval world shows us that sexual freedom is about creating societies that support all the different ways people can thrive. When we fight for reproductive rights, marriage equality, and relationship choice, we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're taking part in humanity's longest-running project to create a world that honors all the ways people love. Tonight, as you go to sleep, I hope you'll remember the bravery of women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, the creativity of those who ran secret health networks, and the strength of the plague survivors who built new families. Their stories remind us that people can create beautiful, loving relationships even in the hardest of times. And most importantly, remember that their story is your story too. The same drive for freedom and real connection that moved people then moves people today. The future of sex and relationships depends on whether we have the courage to continue their experiments. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey. It's been an honor to share these stories and to explore how our past can help us create a better future. Please let me know in the comments what surprised you most. Sweet dreams, everyone. Tomorrow, we'll start a new adventure together. Until then, may your dreams be filled with the courage, creativity, and love that have always shown the best of what it means to be human.